Every month a parade would pass through my hometown, but we were never allowed to look at it. I've lived in Arizona for the past 15 years of my life, but I had a very different life before that. I used to live in a small town in the middle of nowhere. I couldn't even tell you what side of the country it's on, or if it's even in the United States. It was a small forest town with dense trees in all directions. But where exactly this particular forest is, well, your guess is as good as mine. The only thing I know for certain is the name of the town, Point Pine. I lived in Point Pine for the October 1st years of my life before we moved to summer after my 10th birthday. Once we left, my parents never spoke of it again. In fact, they acted as if it never even existed. And to them, I guess it didn't. I don't really blame them either. I caught on pretty quickly and realized that they were trying their hardest to forget the memory of Point Pine. Whenever kids at school asked me where I was from, I simply told them I was from a small town that they'd never heard of. I also learned early on that any questions about Point Pine would be met with punishments. A few months after we moved to Arizona, my older sister Felicity had a school project about family history. She did it on our life in Point Pine and wrote about some of the things she remembered from there. Our mom found her project the day before she turned it in and burned it in the backyard. When Felicity came home that afternoon, my parents took her up to her bedroom, where I heard Felicity crying out every few minutes in what I assumed was pain. I said nothing, and from that moment on, neither one of us mentioned Point Pine again, except for me right now. I've decided to tell all of you about it. I don't know what's causing me to remember all these things that I locked up in the deepest parts of my brain. Maybe it's the fact that my father died about a week ago. Since he died, my mom has remained silent, hasn't said a word to anyone. She hasn't even cried. In fact, she ended up sending my father's remains off to God knows where. My money is on Point Pine, although I'd be crazy to ask. I started recalling random little things about the town that, at the time, seemed like normal, everyday things that we as residents were all used to. Now, as I look back, I realize that they're not as normal as I thought back then. One peculiar thing about Point Pine had to do with the Point Pine Bakery. Whenever you went in there, the owner, Mr. Terrence, always knew what you were about to order. I remember the kids having some sort of rumor about Mr. Terrence being a magician who could read minds. Also, whenever you paid for your baked goods, you had to tip Mr. Terrence with an old item of clothing that you had grown out of. There was a giant box up by the register that everyone tossed old baby clothing and shoes into. That was one of the odd things, although you'll come to realize that it won't seem that weird in comparison to some of the other things about Point Pine. Every year on your birthday, you had to get blood work done. I don't think anyone really knew what the point of this was, or if they were actually looking for something. We just all knew that our birthdays would start off with a trip to the Point Pine Labs. Everyone had to be up at 8:13 a.m. There was a system of speakers placed around the town, like an amusement park or something. And at 8:13 a.m., without fail, the wailing alarm sound would ricochet through the neighborhoods, waking everybody up. This was followed by parents running to wake up their children and get them out of bed as quickly as possible, like the house was on fire or something. Sometimes I expected it to be. All the Point Pine schools were placed in different areas of the town. Point Pine Elementary was towards the east side, Point Pine Middle School was in the west, Point Pine High was in the dead center of town, and Point Pine University was up on a small hill towards the south. If you hadn't noticed by now, every place in town was named Point Pine. The Point Pine Cafe, Point Pine Mall, Point Pine Grocery, etc. Certainly, one of the weirdest things by far that took place in Point Pine was the Point Pine Monthly Parade. It happened every month without fail. It was never on the same date, and each month a student from Point Pine High was chosen to be in it. The weird thing about this parade was that we weren't allowed to watch it go by. Not out on the streets, not from the windows, and not even on television. That was one of the most enforced rules. You must never, under any circumstance, look at the parade. In fact, for the most part, we weren't even allowed outside when the parade passed through. We always knew when the parade was about to start, because it always happened the same way. You would hear a chorus of voices, like a church choir singing a melody. It wasn't a familiar one that I knew. I was only familiar with it in the sense that I heard it once a month. It sounded like it could be from a nursery rhyme or something similar. The voices seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It was like they were coming from the sky, the ground, the trees, the buildings, like everything in Point Pine was singing. Once you heard the first note, you had 5 minutes to get inside a house or a building that had locks on the doors. This might come as a surprise, but in Point Pine, not many buildings contain locks. So if you happen to be out and about on the street when the singing started, you had about 3 options on the places you could go. One of the schools, the staff break room, and the Point Pine bar, or the fridge and the Point Pine pizza shop. One year in the month of August, my friend Lee and I decided that we were going to break the rules and not go inside when the parade passed. Now that I think about it, I'm surprised that kids didn't do this more often, considering that, well, when you tell kids that they must absolutely never do something, they often do that exact thing. Since we didn't know when the parade was coming, where it started, or the exact path that it took around town, we decided the smartest thing to do would be to wait in the forest near the Point Pine Library until the parade eventually came down that street. So, we basically decided to spend about half of the month of August hanging out near or around the library. Around the third week of the month, while we were sitting on the steps of the library talking about some random things that aren't important, we heard the music start. Lee and I looked at each other and then took off running into the trees while everyone else raced to the nearest school. We went far enough into the forest that someone on the street wouldn't see us, but stayed close enough so that we were still able to see a part of the road. We waited for a while, whispering to each other and then shushing one another as we waited for the infamous parade to pass. This year, my sister's friend Reed was chosen to work on the parade. She was a few years older than my sister, but they were friends because Reed used to live next door to us when we were younger. We were crouching in the bushes and leaves when we heard the chorus of voices getting louder and therefore closer. "Dude, I totally see it," Lee hissed. I straightened my back a little in my crouched position to see what Lee was seeing. I was always a short kid. Even now I'm shorter than most guys my age, or any age really, so Lee always pretty much towered over me. "I can't see anything," I said, shifting my position. "Sure, they might hear us," Lee hissed. I stopped moving and instead waited for them to get closer, where they were bound to pass right in front of my line of sight. Oh no. Oh crap. Suddenly Lee dove to the ground, landing in the fetal position, with his head cradled in his hands. "What?" I asked, looking from him to the street. "I saw her. I saw the girl," he exclaimed. "Reed?" I asked, looking over to try to spot her. Lee grabbed me and slammed me down to the ground. "Oh, what was that for?" I asked. "You don't want to look at it," Lee replied. I noticed that for the first time in all the years I'd known him, Lee looked absolutely terrified. I turned my back on the parade and sat down to look at Lee instead. "What did you see?" I whispered. "Those things, they did something to her. They're eating her, Cody, but she doesn't even care." I looked at Lee, who still had his head in his hands, and he was crying now. I sat with my back to the parade, no longer wanting to see. I heard the singing get louder. "Cody," I heard the voices calling. "Don't look," Lee whispered. "Cody, Cody." Now the voice sounded like Reed. "Look at us, Cody." I shut my eyes. The voices went on for a few minutes longer, and at one point Lee started wailing. I kept my eyes shut the entire time. After that, it moved along and continued its way through town. Once we began to hear everyone come out of their hiding places, I stood up and leaned down to help Lee get up. Once he stood up, he kept his head down. "Lee, what's wrong?" I asked. I could hear him sniffling. "Lee," he finally responded as he lifted his head. I caught my eyes. I will never forget the dark, bleeding holes in Lee's face and the cuts around his skin. I threw up in the forest for a good 3 minutes before I was able to help lead Lee out of the forest. A few adults saw us and got our parents, who came and got us right away. The day after that, my family moved out of Point Pine. I never knew what became of Lee after that day. Minutes after we left, my parents acted like Point Pine never existed. It was never discussed, and I never had the nerve to ask about Lee again. As far as I know, Lee was the only person who ever saw the parade, and he was never able to see anything else after that. I don't know if Point Pine still exists. I'd like to go check it out again, but even if I knew where it was or how to get there, I don't think I'd ever go back. I have a feeling that I wouldn't exactly get a warm welcome. Although I can't shake the thought that my parents were somehow still connected to the town, even after all those years. Every 13th of the month, a new apartment appears in my building. I inherited Point Pine Oaks from my grandfather after my father wanted nothing to do with it. I, on the other hand, was broke and in need of a place to stay and a job. And well, beggars can't be choosers. So that's the answer to the question that I get asked any time that I'm out and about on the streets of our town. How on earth did you get stuck with that place? Everyone can see what Point Pine Oaks is, which is an apartment building that is 6 stories tall with 12 apartments on each floor. The outside of the building looks pretty normal. It's just a brick building at the end of Brayer Road, which is a cul-de-sac that contains no other buildings on the street except for Point Pine Oaks. My grandfather bought the building in late 2013. It had been abandoned for over 3 decades, and the town was eager for someone to buy it. It became his passion project, and the building soon became the biggest apartment building in all of Point Pine. Any resident of Point Pine knows that the Oaks are anything but normal, however. For starters, no one ever decides to move in. If people want an apartment, they have to go all the way to the opposite side of town where the apartment complex is. You see, people don't move into the Oaks. They just kind of appear. Every 13th of the month, a new apartment appears until each floor has 12 of them. And then the following year, a new floor appeared to accommodate the next 12 apartments. Oh, and I suppose I should also mention none of the residents are human, at least not normal living humans. My grandfather made it very clear to me that humans do not live in Point Pine Oaks, with the exception of the owner, which is now me. He never explained to me why humans are not allowed in the Oaks, and I never really asked because it just felt kind of like the rule that you follow without asking any questions. The entire first floor houses people who have died outside of the town. You see, any time a prior resident of Point Pine dies, they wake up again here in Point Pine. Usually they're put in some secluded house up in the mountains, but for reasons unknown, they all ended up here at the Point Pine Oaks in 2014. The second floor houses the creatures with eyes that are too wide, teeth that are too sharp, and skin that is too green. They first appeared in Point Pine in 2015 and have been in charge of the farmers market since. They're relatively nice and tend to mind their own business, but that doesn't mean that they don't still freak me out every time I see them in the building, with their incredibly long arms dragging on the floor. On the 3rd floor is where the collectors live. The leader of the collectors is 10-year-old Mary Lou Birmingham. Mary Lou is the one who collects children's teeth. Of course, she doesn't take them right out of their mouths. That would be horrifying. She sneaks into their homes after their baby teeth fall out and takes them from under their pillows instead, like the Tooth Fairy. Most of the collectors are children, with the exception of Old Man Jones, who is an old man. Some of the children collect dead bugs, others collect less unsettling things like flowers, but some collect the dirt from graves in the cemetery. On the 4th floor live all the people who died in 2017 when the bell tower appeared in Windsor Park. No one ever figured out what the deal was with that bell tower, but exactly 12 people died that year as soon as they saw it. Once the people of Point Pine picked up on the pattern, they stopped going into Windsor Park. Of course, after that, the bell on the tower would just ring every month and still manage to kill more people, but that's a different story. On the 5th floor are the invisible vampires, but we don't talk about them. The 6th floor appeared this year, and so far the tenants of that floor were not of one specific species, and they don't seem to have anything in common. The first family to appear has no mouths and communicates by somehow talking inside my head. In February, one of the sacrifices from the Point Pine Parade showed up in March. It was a headless man. April brought a family of cucuys that almost gave me a heart attack the first time I saw them. They were by far the most horrifying residents of the building, with their huge red eyes that rattled around in their skulls and their decaying black skin that was crawling with maggots. Upon opening their mouths, the building shook with a horrible screeching sound that was like nails on a chalkboard at 600% volume. In May, a seemingly normal-looking family moved in, which terrified me just a bit more than the cucuys had until they invited me to dinner, and I watched their lower jaws drop to their shoulders as each one ate an entire raw chicken in one bite. June brought a demon who would routinely set fires in the building, but other than that, It appeared to stay out of everyone else's way. Last month brought the Wendigos, which were by far the hardest to deal with. We had to come up with an agreement that they would only eat the undead folks on the first floor since they would just wake up in their apartment again the next day, and therefore they wouldn't technically be hurting anybody today. The new apartment didn't appear until noon. This was odd because they usually appear right at midnight on the 13th. I stood on the 6th floor, staring at the empty wall until a door suddenly appeared. Apartment number 68. I took a few deep breaths to prepare myself for whatever hideous monster would answer the door, and then lifted my hand to knock. Coming, someone called from inside. I heard footsteps approach, and then the door opened in front of me. There was a woman standing in the apartment. She looked normal enough, tall and blonde, with a tattoo of a rose on her left forearm. Oh, hi. I'm the owner of the building, the landlord. My name is Eric. I extended my hand out, bracing myself for some sort of heat or coldness or shock. I'm Gwen. Nice to meet you. She shook my hand with a strong grip. It was a normal handshake, but I wasn't going to relax just yet. I needed to give it a few minutes to know what exactly these new residents were. Oh, come in. I'll introduce you to my family. I slowly followed her into the apartment. I looked around. It seemed pretty normal. Then again, all the apartments seem normal. It's the things that live inside that aren't normal. Hey guys, come out here. One called into the apartment. Would you like some water? She asked. Oh, no thanks, I replied. I turned at the sound of footsteps to see two kids and another woman walk out into the kitchen. This is my wife, Laura, and our kids, Kimberly and Christopher. Nice to meet you. Laura stuck her hand out and I shook it. Again, it was normal. I'm Eric. I'm the owner of the building, I replied. Nice to meet you. There was a brief moment of awkward silence. So, do you have any questions? I asked. The kids took off as I stood there with Gwen and Laura. Oh, yeah, so what are the rules? Are we allowed to, paint the walls and hang stuff up? Gwen asked. Oh, yeah, you can decorate this place however you want. I replied. Awesome, she exclaimed. So if you don't mind me asking, what are you? I asked, fidgeting with my hands. Excuse me, Laura asked. What are you? I don't mean to be offensive or anything. I'd just like to know. Laura and Gwen exchanged looks like lesbians. Are you allowed to ask that? Gwen asked, narrowing her eyebrows. No, I mean what are you? I know you're not human. Laura laughed. Not human? What do you think we are? Like mythical creatures? Well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking. I mean, your neighbors are Wendigos, and there's a family of Kukuis down the hall. I pointed out the door. Is this some kind of joke? Is it because we're new? Gwen asked. No, I replied, confused. Well, then we're just regular humans, Laura chuckled awkwardly. I stared at them. Haven't you ever seen a human before? Not a regular one. At least not in this building. Hey, now you're freaking me out, Gwen said. Do you know where you are? I asked. Well, sure. We're in Colorado, right? No, this isn't Colorado. What do you mean? Where are we then? Point Pine, I replied. Where? You're in Point Pine. It's a small town in the middle of nowhere. Laura ran to the window in the living room and pulled the curtains back and gasped. What is it? Gwen asked, turning around. Their window had a view of some of the buildings down below, along with a giant sign right outside. Welcome to Point Pine. Population, unknown. I don't understand. How do we get here? I shrugged. I don't really know how people get here. They sort of just show up. Okay, then how do we get to Colorado? Laura asked, looking away from the window. You don't, I replied. What do you mean? You can't willingly leave Point Pine once you're here. Everyone who leaves gets banished. And even then, when you die out there, you just wake up here and you're stuck again. Gwen sighed, and Laura ran her hands through her black hair. So you don't know why we're here? Laura asked. I shook my head. But if you really are just human, then this can't be good. After a few minutes of silence, I left the apartment and decided to go outside to get some fresh air. I stepped onto the elevator and pressed the button to the first floor. I got off and made my way down to the doors, stopping as I reached out to open it. I looked down at the watch on my wrist. It was still noon, but that wasn't possible. I'd been up in the apartment for at least 20 minutes. But that wasn't the only thing that was wrong. It was pitch black outside. I couldn't even see the sidewalk right outside the door or the giant tree that was a few feet in front of the building. I pressed my forehead against the glass, squinting to see if I could make out something in the darkness. Suddenly, someone crashed right into the glass, causing me to jump back at least a few feet in fright. Holy shit, I gasped. Hey, open the door. I walked closer and realized that I recognized the person who was outside. It was Lee. Everyone knew who he was since he had lost his eyes to the Point Pine parade years ago. Lee opened the door. I had heard that he'd gotten his eyes back at the farmer's market, and now that I was seeing him, I could tell that it was true. I reached out to open the door, but it was stuck. I tried again, pulling on it as hard as I could, but it didn't budge. It stuck, I said. Suddenly, Lee went flying backward, and I watched as the darkness lifted and the sun came out again. I looked down at my watch, still at noon. When I looked back up, I found myself standing in the hallway of the 6th floor again as apartment number 68 appeared in front of me once again. I reached out and knocked. Coming. Someone called from inside. Footsteps approached, and then the door opened in front of me. Hi, Gwen, I asked. Yeah, who are you? I'm Eric. We just spoke, I said. I'm sorry, you must have confused me for someone else. I didn't reply, staring into the apartment as Laura and the kids came out. That was at least an hour ago, but the same chain of events keeps repeating every few minutes, and the time has not moved past noon. I don't know how to undo it. I don't even know what it is. I'm pretty sure I know what's causing it, though. Humans shouldn't live in Point Pine Oaks. There's a new guy in town, and we don't like him. We really don't know when he got here. He was just here this morning, although I guess he could have gotten here sometime last night or even earlier today. But of course we wouldn't know since we don't wake up until 8:13 a.m. I guess if he got here before then, he would have snuck in unnoticed. We don't like him. I can't speak for everybody, but everyone who I have spoken to would agree. We aren't too fond of strangers popping in out of the blue. It makes us nervous. How did he find us? We don't know why he's here, although I've heard that he's been claiming that he's from here. Still, he's been out there in the outside world for way too long. He's new to us, even if we aren't new to him. I heard someone say that his name was Cody. I don't know anyone named Cody, and I've lived here for over 10 years. I first saw him while I was on my morning run. He was walking up Brayer Road, which leads to Point Pine Oaks, and I stopped for a second, watching him. That's how I knew that he wasn't from here. Anyone who's from here would know that the Point Pine Oaks has been stuck in a time loop for the past 4 months. They'd also know that the Point Pine Oaks doesn't take guests, at least not guests who walk in and ask for a room. I stood on the corner until he walked back down the road. What are you doing? I called. That ain't used to be here. He gestured towards the Oaks. Yeah, I'm assuming it's not a normal apartment building, he said, walking closer to me. Right. I'm looking for someone. Do you think you can help me? I looked around the empty ST. I don't know you. Yeah, I haven't been back here in 15 years. Gosh, that's a long time. Not that much has changed, though, he chuckled. I said nothing. Anyway, I'm looking for my dad. He died about 7 months ago. Well, if he's dead, then why are you looking for him? Don't you know where he is? In the ground somewhere. No. He stared at me. Everyone knows you never really leave Point Pine. He was right, but I wasn't going to help him. Sorry, I wouldn't even know where to start looking, I replied. That was a lie. I knew exactly where to start looking. He was probably in one of the houses up in the mountains or in the Oaks. Oh, that's fine. I'll go find some people that I know. They should still be here. Have fun with your walk. I watched as he walked away towards the center of town, where most of the shops were. He stopped a few feet away and slowly turned back to look at me. Hey, has the parade happened this month? He asked. It made me nervous that he knew about that. No, I said. He mumbled something that I didn't quite catch and continued walking. I was too anxious to finish my run, so I went home instead. I heard Cody's back. My father was on the phone as I walked into the kitchen. Haven't seen that boy in years, and suddenly he just manages to show up here. Crazy, ain't it? He huffed. He looked up and saw me. Oh, I'll call you back. How was your run? Who's Cody? Just a boy. Is it cold out? I met him. Cody, I met him on my run. He sighed. He's looking for his father. Right. Is he that Cody? I asked. I could tell he didn't want to talk about it. I went to the farmer's market, I said instead. There were a lot of people around today, more than usual at least. I walked around a few stands, trying my best to avoid the creature's green skin and the wide eyes and the sharp teeth, which was hard since they were in charge of the farmer's market. I was at a produce stand when I saw Cody again. Everyone got quiet and started whispering among themselves. I hid behind a wooden pole before he saw me. I didn't want to be seen speaking to him. Reed. Everyone looked towards Cody as he walked up to Reed, who was in the middle of buying something. Cody? So she did know him, which meant he was telling the truth. He was from Point Pine. That still didn't seem to make anyone any friendlier towards him, though. I thought you. The parade. I knew Reed had been in the parade years ago, and had only appeared in February of this year in the Point Pine Oaks. Yeah, I'm back, she said. I'm looking for my father. Do you have any idea where I could find him? He's at the Oaks, first floor. I see him from time to time. The Oaks, he repeated. Yeah, but you can't go in there, I figured. I can tell him for you, though. I live there, Reed said. What about Lee? He asked. He's somewhere around here, Reed replied. She was right. He was somewhere being the time loop at the Oaks. I wondered why she didn't specify that. I looked around and I noticed that no one else was speaking. It was dead silent. Cody and Reed must have noticed too, because they stopped talking and looked around. I don't think they like me much, Cody whispered. He was right. We didn't. I saw him again later that day as I was leaving the Point Pine Library. I just returned some books that my father had checked out on gardening, and I saw him talking to Mr. Terrence outside the Point Pine Bakery. I stood on the steps of the library. They seemed to be having a normal conversation. Mr. Terrence was laughing at something that Cody had said, and it made me weary of him. I already didn't trust Cody, and now I don't trust Mr. Terrence. They continued to talk, and I noticed other bystanders giving them weird looks. I decided that it was time for me to leave and began walking down the steps and onto the sidewalk. That's when the chorus of voices started singing. I took off running immediately, as did the rest of the people standing around. I knew everyone would head for the Point Pine bar first, which meant it would get full and I'd only have to go back and find somewhere else to hide. Point Pine Middle School was my best bet. It was only about 2 minutes away if I ran fast enough, and so I took off in that direction. I ran as the familiar melody filled my ears. It seemed like it was coming from all around me, above me, and below me. I ran faster, seeing the school in the distance. I threw open the doors and walked in. There were only about 20 or so people in here, but I knew it would get full in no time. I sat down on the floor, trying to catch my breath. Marcus, can you watch the doors for me? The parade starts in exactly 3 minutes. Make sure you lock them and get everyone inside before then. I got back up as Mrs. Monroe handed me the keys. I walked over to the door, propping it open with my body as people ran inside the school. I could see more and more people coming down the street, frantically running as the start of the parade got closer and closer. 2 minutes left. The crowd of people had thinned out. Now there were only a few people trickling in at the last minute. 1 minute left. I could see someone coming in the distance, and I squinted, trying to make out who it was. 50 seconds. As the person got closer, I saw that it was none other than Cody. 40 seconds. I began to close the door. 20 seconds. Cody picked up his speed, shouting for me to wait. I kept closing the door slowly. Wait, please. Cody shouted. I watched as he got closer and closer, and time seemed to slow down as he desperately ran towards the door. I looked at the time. 10 seconds. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5. I shut the door and locked it. 4. Cody banged on the small glass window. "Let me in, please," he cried. 3. I let the small curtain fall and covered up the window. 2. "Come on." 1. I heard his footsteps as he ran away, but it was too late. There was nowhere else to go now. The parade had already begun. "Who was that?" Mrs. Monroe asked. "The new guy," I replied. She stayed quiet, and so did everyone else in the school. Like I said, we don't like him. The day the angel came, the rooftop of the Point Pine Hospital overlooks the town and the surrounding woods. In the distance, you can see the sign that welcomes you to Point Pine, although it's too far away to read from up here. Not that it matters, I already know what it says anyway. "Welcome to Point Pine. Population unknown. People usually come up here to smoke. I don't smoke, but I like coming up here and looking down at all the people in town who are walking around running errands and whatnot. They look so small from up here, like ants, and sometimes I imagine a giant foot coming down from the sky and squishing everything in town. It's gruesome, I know, but I've always had an overactive imagination. Besides, it gets boring being in a hospital bed all the time. The beeping of the machines and the smell of antiseptic is enough to make anyone go crazy after a while, so I like to get away for some time. Usually that means about 30 minutes before a nurse realizes that I'm missing. I'm sure they know where I am by now, and I think they like to give me some time before they come up to get me because they normally don't show up until about an hour after I get up here. I'm not sure if they're allowed to do that, but I appreciate it nonetheless. But enough about me. This story isn't about me. At least not really. It's about the people of Point Pine, and it's about Apollo. I met Apollo a few hours ago on the rooftop of the Point Pine Hospital. I'd been up there for no more than 15 minutes when I suddenly noticed him standing a few feet away from me, leaning over the edge, staring at the town below us. He was dressed in all black, including a black hat that covered most of his face and dirty, worn-out boots. I was startled because I hadn't noticed anyone else out here when I came up. It was like he had just appeared out of nowhere, and given the number of odd things that occur in this town, I wouldn't be all that surprised if he had. He was smoking a cigarette, and the wind was blowing the smoke directly into my face. I stifled a cough and turned the other way. Don't know what it is yet, do they? I looked over at him, but he continued to look down on the smoke. Again, it blew into my face, and I tried not to cough. "Excuse me?" I asked. He turned to face me, but I couldn't make out the top half of his face due to the shadow caused by his hat. "The doctors. They don't know what you've got," he replied, taking another drag from his cigarette. This time, when he exhaled and the smoke blew into my face, I coughed. He had an accent, but I couldn't quite place it. "Sorry." He tossed the cigarette on the floor and used his heel to put it out. "How do you know?" I asked after a few minutes of silence. "Because I know a lot of things about a lot of people." I stepped closer to him. "Like what?" He turned back towards the town below us and pointed off to the right. "You see that man over there, in the brown coat, walking out of the library?" I squinted and found the man that he was talking about. However, I couldn't tell who it was from up here. He killed his 5-year-old son about 2 months ago and let his wife go to prison for it. "That's awful," I said. "People are pretty awful, yeah. You know Mr. Terrence, the psychic baker?" he asked. "Yeah, is he a murderer too?" He shook his head. No, he's one of the good ones. But his mother used to torture his sister when they were younger." "Mr. Terrence has a sister?" I asked. "Had? She's dead. It has been for a few years. Suicide." There were a few minutes of silence as we watched people walking through town. "Who are you?" I asked finally. "Apollo," he replied. I nodded. "And you're Daphne." I nodded again. "How do you know all these things?" I asked. He sighed. "Let's just say, I'm not exactly human," he replied after a few seconds. "So, what are you? An angel?" "An angel?" "Yup, an angel." "So, why are you here in Point Pine?" I asked. "Someone is going to do something really bad soon." I need to be here for that. I thought about all the bad things that happened here. Things like the parade and the time loop that lasted a few months. How bad? I asked. Worse than the parade and worse than the time loop. I stared at the people below us, tiny like ants, walking around town. I thought again about a giant foot coming down from the sky and destroying everything. What could be worse than the things we'd already seen? See that car? The one driving into the woods? I nodded as I watched the tiny white car become even smaller as it drove. There's a woman in the car. She's going to kill herself. Why? He turned to look at me, but this time I could see his face. His eyes and mouth were like two glowing slits in his face. I backed up. Because her daughter's sick, and the doctors don't know what it is. But they do know that she's dying, and that woman would rather run away from her problems and never face them again. What? I whispered. The door to the roof swung open, and two nurses came out. When I looked back as they dragged me inside, Apollo was nowhere to be found, and the only thing that was left of him was the cigarette he'd thrown on the ground. The nurses told me I was dying. They said my mom wanted to tell me. They couldn't get a hold of her, but someone saw her steal a white car, and drive off. I don't think this is the bad thing that Apollo was talking about. It's starting to get gray outside. The sun is getting dimmer and dimmer as the minutes pass. I can tell that something is going to happen. Everyone is acting jittery and anxious. The nurses have started to ask everyone to keep the blinds shut, but I've gotten up and taken a few peeks. It doesn't seem to be getting any better. The temperature has dropped significantly inside the hospital, and I heard someone say that the trees in the woods have fused together to form a giant wall around town. Not that anyone could leave town before that anyway, but now they can't even venture out into the woods. I didn't believe Apollo before, but I guess he was right. I got out of bed once when no one was looking because they were too preoccupied with man next door who was coughing blood. I walked over to the window and pulled back the blinds just a bit. I was face to face with Apollo, who was floating in midair, his eyes glowing. Behind him were dozens of other angels. I didn't tell anyone what I saw. I simply closed the blinds and got back into bed. If I listen really closely, I can hear the worried conversations of the other patients. The nurses seem to be the most worried, though. They keep whispering to one another and looking into my room. I heard one of them say that I'm probably going to die soon, maybe within the next few days. I would be relieved if it weren't for the fact that nobody ever really leaves Point Pine. Room 813, Point Pine's newest attraction, 11 a.m., and I wasn't in my room. But that isn't the first thing I focused on. I was more worried about the fact that I was awake before the 813 alarm. No one was supposed to be awake before the 813 alarm. And yet, here I was. And not only was I awake, but I was in a room that was not my own. I didn't know how I got here. I also had no idea where I was in general. It was obviously a hotel room, but this wasn't the Point Pine Hotel. I sat up in the king-size bed and looked around at the dark red carpet and the thick golden curtains that covered the window, which took up most of the wall to my left. I was too scared to move until it was 8:13, thinking that this was some trap to find people who were breaking the rules. 13, I heard the town alarm. Only the sound was muffled, coming from outside and not inside the room, which was odd. I got out of bed and slipped my feet into my slippers, slowly getting up and walking over to the window to pull the curtain back a few inches. I could see the town below me, the bakery, the high school, and the hospital a few blocks down. I realized I was pretty high up, but also I realized that this building was right where Windsor Park used to be. The strange thing, however, was that Windsor Park was here yesterday, and I knew this because I passed it on my evening jog. So, how did an entire building appear within a few hours? And how did I end up in this building when I lived across town? A soft knock on my door distracted me for a second, and I walked across the room and towards the door. Yes, I called. Room service? A voice replied. I opened the door to see a person standing outside. It was difficult for me to tell their gender, and their shaved head made it a bit harder. They were wearing a simple black uniform and standing behind a cart that contained food and a French press. I didn't order this, I said. Courtesy of the hotel. They replied in a monotone voice. Right about that. I began as they pushed the cart into the room. What is this place, and how did I get here in Point Pine? They didn't answer and simply uncovered the plates of food and walked back out. I stared at the food and eventually decided to grab a few berries off one of the plates, and then walked out into the hall to investigate the rest of the hotel while I ate the berries. They were incredibly sweet, and I felt like I was eating candy instead of fruit. As I closed the door, I saw the room number on the small golden plaque, 813. Weird, I mumbled as I began walking down the hallway, noticing that the person from earlier had vanished entirely. I walked up to the elevator, which opened as I stepped in front of it, and I stepped inside, pressing the button to the lobby. I stood silently inside the elevator, watching the floor numbers decrease as it went down. Finally, the elevator dinged and the doors opened. I stepped out into the lobby, which had a very simple, less lavish decor than the room did. There was a big wooden desk to the left of the elevator, but nobody was behind it. I walked closer and saw a handwritten note on the desk. Back in 8 minutes. Deciding that I didn't want to wait around, I made my way towards the hotel doors and pushed them open. I found that they were extremely heavy, and I had to lean on them and push them open using all of my body weight. The slippers that I wore weren't much help, and they slid against the floor of the lobby, but I managed to get the door open enough to slip outside. I stood on the sidewalk and looked around. There were a few people walking around already, and a gust of ice-cold wind hit me suddenly, making me jump and causing goosebumps to erupt all over my body. I crossed my arms across my chest, wishing that I had at least looked for a robe or something. Looks like you need this. I turned to see the same person as before, standing to my left and holding out a black robe. I took it and put it on. When I looked up again, they were gone. Feeling somewhat unsettled, I began my walk into town, passing a few people who were out on a morning run. A chihuahua on a leash yapped at me as I passed by. I made my way to the Point Pine Cafe. There wasn't a line, which was out of the ordinary at this hour. As I walked up to the counter, I realized that I didn't have any money on me. "Shit," I whispered. "Rough night?" I turned to see Edwin, one of the baristas, walking up behind me as he started to clean off a table. "What? You're in your pajamas, Bev, right?" "Yeah," I replied. "Are you okay?" he asked, waving closer to me. "Yeah, I woke up in the hotel. I don't remember how I got there." "You walked here from the Point Pine Hotel?" Edwin raised his eyebrows. No, not that hotel. The Hotel Non-Dormant." "What?" I pointed in the direction of the hotel. "It's right down the street where Windsor Park used to be." He stared at me for a few minutes before walking outside the cafe and looking down the street in the direction of the hotel. I watched him stare for a while before turning back and coming inside. Another gust of wind made it into the cafe, and I shivered. "When the hell did that get there?" he asked. I shrugged. "When did you get there?" Another worker that I'm not familiar with came out of the kitchen. "The hotel down the street. The Hotel Non-Dormant. That's always been there." She replied. "No, it hasn't," I said. "Of course it has. It's been here since I've been here, and I was born and raised in Point Pine." "Well, so were Bev and I, and we remember Windsor Park being there," Edwin pointed out. The girl shook her head. "Why would we have called the place Windsor Park? Everything is named after the town of Point Pine." "The hotel isn't," I said. She said nothing. The door to the cafe opened again, and we all jumped as another cold dust of wind pushed its way inside. We all turned to see who'd walked in, and I saw a man I didn't recognize. He was dressed in an expensive-looking suit, but his hair and beard looked unkempt. "Hi, welcome to the Point Pine Cafe." The girl greeted him. Edwin and I looked at each other. "Are you new?" Edwin asked, stepping in front of the man and blocking his way towards the counter. "No." "Where did you come from, then?" I asked. "The hotel down the street." "Now can you move? I need some coffee." Edwin stepped out of the way and looked like he was about to say something else, only he was interrupted by some shouting that was coming from outside. I followed him as we walked towards the door and pulled it open. As we stepped out, I noticed just how cold it was. I was shivering uncontrollably, and I already couldn't feel my nose, lips, fingers, or toes. I wrapped my arms around myself for warmth and watched as two men pushed each other around on the sidewalk. A crowd was beginning to form. Edwin walked in between the men and placed one hand on each man's chest, trying to stop the fight from escalating. They towered over him comically, but neither attempted moving. "What's going on?" Edwin asked. "He's pulling some kind of prank on me, making me think I'm crazy." The man on the left replied. He was bigger than the other man and dressed in workout clothes. "It's not a prank. He thinks the hotel just showed up today for some stupid reason. I know it's been there the whole time." The second man shouted defensively as he adjusted the Point Pine High School sweatshirt. Edwin looked over at me, and then we both looked down the street. There was a crowd starting to form outside the hotel, and it looked like even more people were beginning to argue and fight with each other. I jogged down the street as the cold wind blew in my face, feeling like thousands of needles were being pressed into my skin. I reached the crowd of people in front of the hotel and tried to catch my breath as I watched a woman grab her baby's bottle, unscrew it, and then pour the contents over another woman who screamed. I noticed a guy named Jeffrey who was running towards an older man. When he reached him, he tackled him to the ground and the two fell right in front of me. I tried to move out of the way, but tripped over them and fell. I felt my head bounce off the concrete before everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in the hotel room. There was something cold on my head, which I realized was an ice pack. And the same room service worker from earlier was standing near my bed. Or was it the same worker? I couldn't exactly remember, but they sure did look familiar. Still, there was something off about them. "What happened?" I asked, trying to sit up. "Oh, you should be careful. You hit your head pretty hard." I managed to sit up all the way. Noticed that the curtains had been pulled back completely, giving me a full view of the town below me. It was absolute chaos. It looked like the setting of a post-apocalyptic movie down there. People were running around like lunatics. Some were still fighting, and others simply watched. "How'd the hotel get here?" I asked, not looking away from the window. "That depends who you ask." The worker responded, "I'm asking you." There was a period of silence, and I had to look to make sure they hadn't left. "The hotel was always here, right? So when did it get here?" I asked. "Well, that's a little hard to remember, isn't it?" "What?" The worker began to walk towards the door, evading my questions. "Enjoy your stay at the hotel. I suggest you stay inside. You're much safer here." I turned back to the window. As the door to my hotel room closed below me, the town continued to tear itself apart. Point Pine's newest visitor came with a warning. Mary Lou Birmingham took my sister Genevieve's tooth this morning. I saw her leaving the house when I got up to make breakfast. I only saw the back of her head as she walked out our front door, but I would recognize those bright red curls anywhere. This wasn't anything out of the ordinary, at least not here in Point Pine. That's just what collectors do. They collect stuff. No one really knows why or what they do with it, except for Mary Lou. We've seen her wearing jewelry made from the teeth of the people of Point Pine. She obviously doesn't wear all the teeth. That would be weird. And so I've always wondered what she did with the rest of them. Last year, when our hamster Pennies died, Curtis Mann came to take it from us. He collects dead animals. Those are the only two collectors that I'm familiar with, but there are 12 total, and they all live at the Point Pine Oaks. Recently, the collectors have been behaving a little weirder than usual. Today, when I went on my run, I saw all of them walking in two single-file lines down the road. I'd never seen all 12 of them together at the same time, so I stopped to observe. They were walking weirdly. They would put one foot forward, then stop for a second, then bring their other foot forward, then stop for a second. They walked like that all the way down the road, headed for the shops in the center of Point Pine. I saw them again about an hour later when I walked to the Point Pine Bakery to pick up a pie for my mom. As I was waiting for them to bring my order out, Mary Lou walked up to me. "Hey, Lee," she said, sounding a bit sad. "Hey, are you all right?" Mary Lou sighed, and I glanced down at the chain she wore around her neck that contained a small glass bottle that was filled with teeth. Suddenly, that pie didn't sound so appetizing. "Why would I be all right?" she asked. I stared at her, not really knowing how to answer. Haven't you heard about the visitor? I shook my head slowly and then glanced over to see if anyone was on their way with my pie yet. No offense to Mary Lou, but she had a tendency of making people feel uncomfortable. Mary Lou sighed again and then reached out and placed her hand on my arm. She wore a ring with a tooth on it on each one of her fingers. I try not to gag. Be cautious with your eyes, Lee. I would hate for you to lose them again, she said, staring at me intently with her huge green eyes. I watched as she walked away. The spot where her hand had rested on my arm felt noticeably colder than the rest of my body, and I rubbed my arm until the feeling went away. I finally got my pie and headed outside. I looked down the road and saw the collectors were back in their two lines, walking in that weird way that they had been earlier. I watched them for a few seconds. Mary Lou turned around, and we locked eyes. She brought both of her hands up to her face and covered her eyes before turning back around and continuing her walk. I turned around and started walking back home, thinking about how Mary Lou was quite possibly the most unsettling 11-year-old that I had ever met. On the walk home, I overheard a few different conversations about the collectors. The people of Point Pine were starting to become irritated with them, convinced that they were playing some sort of prank on everyone. When I got home, my mom was talking about them too. Can you believe it? They told Sandra's kid that she needed to keep an eye on his arms because he might lose them. I mean, who says that to an 8-year-old? Mary Lou told me to be cautious with my eyes. I said as I stepped in and set the pie down on the kitchen table. What? My dad snapped. I'm sure it's fine. They're just weird, I replied. They told Cody that the parade was coming back to get him soon, my mom said. Cody had come back to Point Pine a few months ago and had survived the Point Pine parade twice now. He had been staying with us for a while now, but spent most of his time locked in his room in the basement. She said something about a visitor. What? My dad asked. At the same time, my mom asked. Who? Mary Lou. She asked me if I'd heard about the visitor. What visitor? My mom asked. I don't know. She didn't give me a name. My parents spent the majority of the day questioning what Mary Lou and the rest of the collectors were talking about, and that evening we all got a flyer slipped under our front doors. I was sitting on the couch when it flew across the floor. I walked over and picked it up. It was a black piece of paper with the words "Beware the Visitor" scrawled crudely at the top in white crayon. Below that, in neat writing, also in white crayon, Residents of Point Pine, tomorrow at 7 o'clock a.m. We will have a visitor. We advise you not to interact with him, which shouldn't be a problem since no one is allowed up until 8:13 a.m. He will use this time to wander around town, even your homes. If you hear him, simply pretend to be asleep. He is here to take from you, but as long as you don't interact, you'll be fine. Be careful. The collectors. It didn't take long for people to freak out. Sure, we were all used to weird things happening in Point Pine, but how did the collectors know so much about this? Some people walked over to the Oaks to try and speak to the collectors, but apparently Eric wasn't letting anyone in. Not that I blamed him. After being stuck in that weird time loop with him, I understood his caution when it came to the people that he allowed inside his building. Eventually, people returned to their homes and went to bed. There was an odd feeling like something really bad was going to happen. I tried my best to ignore it and went to bed at my usual time, tossing and turning for a few minutes before finally falling asleep. I awoke when I heard the front door creak open. I turned over in bed and looked at the clock. 5:55 a.m. My heart sped up in my chest as I realized that the visitor was here. I could hear the footsteps coming up the stairs, and I turned so my back was facing my bedroom door, shut my eyes, and tried to even my breathing. As the visitor got closer, I noticed that he was humming a very familiar tune. It took a few minutes before I realized that it was the same music that played whenever the Point Pine parade started. The visitor never stepped into my bedroom, but I heard him wandering around the rest of the house for what felt like hours. Finally, I heard him walk back out the door. I breathed a sigh of relief as I slowly turned back around to look at the clock. 8:08 a.m., 5 minutes until we could be up. I lay there, staring at the ceiling and waiting for the town alarm to ring. Before it did, however, I heard a scream pierce through the morning silence. It sounded like it was coming from the house next door. I froze in bed, not wanting to take a look and risk seeing something that I shouldn't. Mary Lou's voice kept echoing in my mind as I laid there, waiting for the town alarms to go off. Be cautious with your eyes, Lee. I would hate for you to lose them again. Finally, the town alarms went off and I climbed out of bed and made my way downstairs, the rest of my family and Cody following me. I walked over to the living room window and pulled the curtains open a few inches to look outside. Most of the neighbors were now out there, crowding on Humphrey's lawn. My dad opened the front door and Cody and I followed after him, making our way through the crowd of people to try to see what was going on. We pushed through until we got to the front of the crowd and finally managed to see what the big deal was on the front lawn. It was the entire Humphreys family, all four of them, laying on their backs and facing up towards the sky, their eyes darting around the crowd of people above them. Their noses and mouths were completely gone. Everything below their eyes had vanished and was simply replaced with smooth skin. No nose, no nostrils, no lips. Just eyes and smooth skin all the way down their faces. Above their heads was a copy of the flyer I'd gotten last night, stuck in the grass by a rusty butcher knife. Only this flyer was a bit different. It was written on white paper in red font, and it read, "Welcome the visitor" at the top. The rest of the flyer said as follows: Residents of Point Pine, tomorrow at 7 o'clock a.m., we will have a visitor. You have been chosen to interact with him. Congratulations. You will use this time to wander around town, even your homes. When you hear him, get up and say hello. It's an honor to be chosen. He is here to see you, and only you. Be happy, be nice, and don't put up a fight. It won't be worth it. Son, the visitor. The things in the giant bear costumes won't stop handing out popcorn. I hate the carnival. The obnoxious music that's trying way too hard to sound happy, the hundreds of colorful, blinding lights, the mix of popcorn, sweets, peanuts, and sticky, sweaty children. I hate all of it. Of course, because I hate the carnival, it makes perfect sense that I live in Point Pine, where everyone else adores it so much that there's always a carnival in town. It's like the universe wants to torture me. I'm usually able to tolerate it. I just don't go. It's the perfect plan, and so far it's worked out exceptionally well for me. And then they added the dancing bears. They look like normal brown teddy bears with black eyes and a red bow tie. Only these are about 7 feet tall. I saw the first one in the middle of town while I was picking up groceries. It was standing outside the bakery, slowly swaying in place while that stupid carnival music played through some speakers that seemed to be located inside the costume. As I got closer to the giant dancing bear, I thought about kicking whoever had this fantastic idea right in the teeth. When I passed the bear, it held out a bucket of popcorn towards me, seemingly manifesting it out of thin air. It kept swaying as it held the bucket out towards me, staring at it with its stupid, beady eyes. Yeah, no thanks, I scoffed, pushing it aside. The bear dropped the bucket and the popcorn spilled all over the sidewalk. Dumbass, I mumbled as I kept walking. The next time I went into town, there were 3 bears, all identical, all swaying, and all were playing the same stupid carnival music. I think the best part about this was that the music was not playing simultaneously, making the already lousy tune sound even worse, which I didn't really know was possible until now. Every time a person passed by the bears, they would pull a bucket of popcorn out of nowhere and offer it to the bystanders. Every single idiot took it, of course, and I rolled my eyes as their stupid faces filled with joy. After about 3 days of this, the smell of popcorn was everywhere. I swear it was in my skin at that point. It was nauseating. One step outside and you were hit with the smell of popcorn. It even started to seep into my home. All I could smell, it was popcorn. The single semi-tolerable thing was now also ruined, which only further enforced my hatred. And still the bears continued to multiply like bunnies. There was now one on every street corner, even the neighborhoods. The stupid carnival music could be heard everywhere in town. It was so irritating that I thought about jamming something into my ears for some relief. The next time I went out, popcorn filled the streets. It was everywhere. It looked like all of Point Pine was a popcorn machine that incessantly played carnival music. I could tell that even the other people who usually love the carnival were getting tired of it. No one was taking the popcorn anymore, and they weren't even going outside now. I was sitting in my living room trying to watch a movie and tune out the music when a scream pierced through both of those sounds and startled me. I ran to the window and looked outside where a woman was pointing down the street at one of the dancing bears and screaming. One by one, the neighbors started to come out of their homes to investigate the murderous screams, and I saw Andy Cobart take one look down the street and throw up over his rose bushes. Seeing that piqued my interest, so I stepped out my house, out into the popcorn fumes that sat heavily over Point Pine. I walked out onto my popcorn-covered lawn and looked down the street. The giant dancing teddy bear was still there, but whoever it was under the costume had removed the head and was holding it in their hands as they danced. Oh. And the person in the costume didn't have a head. All that came out the top of the costume was a neck that appeared to have sewn together at the top where the head should be. I stared at the headless dancing person as they moved the giant teddy bear head around while they swayed on the street corner. They had been out there for so long now that the carnival music was no longer happy and bubbly. Now it was distorted and creepy. We all stood outside our homes, staring at the headless dancer at the end of the street, not knowing what to do. When weird things happen in Point Pine, we're usually warned about them in advance, and on the off chance that we aren't warned, someone or multiple someones die. A scream erupted from the next street, signaling that the dancing bear had removed its head. Andy's husband, Marwin, walked down the street towards the bear, his feet crunching down on all the popcorn. I watched as he went up to it, and a bucket of popcorn appeared in midair and fell onto Marwin's head. I stifled a laugh as he threw the bucket aside. Marwin reached over and took the bear head away from the dancer, turning it over to examine it. He shook it a few times, and I expected a head to fall out and roll onto the popcorn, but it appeared to be empty. Suddenly, the dancing bear reached out and grabbed Marwin's arm with one of its teddy bear arms. Marwin backed up, trying to get away, but wasn't able to. "What the hell, man?" he shouted as he tried to shake the teddy bear off. Andy ran down the street towards Marwin and attempted to pry the bear away from him. "Why is this thing so strong?" "It's a bear," he wailed in tears. I rolled my eyes and ran over, taking out the small pocket knife I carried in my pockets and cutting the teddy bear arm. The knife tore through the fabric, cutting off about 6 inches of the arm. It sliced right through. The arm was empty. What the? Marwin grabbed the now limp piece of fabric and looked inside of it. They don't even have arms. He was right. Whoever was in the costume had a neck, no head, and apparently no arms. The entire arm that I'd cut was now limp and flapping around as the teddy bear swayed, as if all the stuffing had been taken out. I walked up to the teddy bear again and sank my knife into the chest, dragging it down a few inches. Andy gasped. I stepped back and waited, but nothing happened. I looked back at my neighbors, who were fixated on the teddy bear. After a few minutes, the carnival music stopped and the bear froze in place. I took a few steps back, and suddenly, blood began pouring out of the gash in its chest, spilling down the front of the suit and onto the popcorn on the ground. After that, chunks of stuff began to tumble out of the same gash, falling onto the popcorn with a sick splattering sound. I looked closer at the things that were spilling out of the giant teddy bear and finally realized what was. They were organs. Organs were falling out of the teddy bear. "Is that a liver?" Marwin asked. "Yep," I replied. "And that's a heart," he said. "Yep, lovely." When all the inside stopped falling out of the teddy bear, it crumpled in on itself and sank to the floor, covering the popcorn like a rug. "Is it dead?" Someone called from behind me. "I don't know." At least the music stopped. We all stood in silence in the middle of the popcorn-covered road and stared at the pile of blood and organs. Andy threw up on someone else's lawn, and then Marwin took him back into their house. "Hey, look." I looked up to see that the dancing bear on the street corner across from ours had fallen over. Everyone in that neighborhood simply stared at the empty bear costume, the music stopping. I listened as the music that had been coming from the bears got quieter and quieter. It seemed that killing one of them would kill them all. I breathed a sigh of relief and immediately regretted it as my nose filled with the smell of blood and popcorn. I coughed and gagged but controlled myself before I started throwing up on people's property like Andy. I walked back down the street, heading towards my house, just as I was about to step onto my porch. I felt the ground begin to shake. I held onto the stair railing and looked back just in time to hear a loud pop and see Felicity Green fall backward onto the popcorn in the street. There was a giant hole in the middle of her chest that was still slightly smoking. There was another pop nearby, and the house next door's living room window exploded. What in the fresh hell was that? Someone called as people ran over to Felicity's smoking dead body. It was a colonel. There's no way a colonel just ripped a hole into Felicity's chest. Well, it was a really big colonel. Amidst the voices that were shouting at each other from across the street, there were another 2 pops. I stared at the ground intently and managed to see one colonel pop up into the air and laying a few feet away, making a crack in the sidewalk as the popcorn around the area burned up and started smoking. Now it smelled like burned popcorn. I walked back towards the street, and the closer I got, the hotter the area felt. The roads were heating up. Point Pine was now an actual popcorn machine. I backed up and headed towards my house as the popping started to increase, sending flaming hot kernels everywhere. I ran inside and locked my door, heading to my living room window and pulling the curtains back to look outside. Everyone was now in their homes, and all that was left in the street was burned popcorn and Felicity's body, which was still smoking and now appeared to be cooking from the heat that was coming from the road. I glanced down the street, where the loose organs were now beginning to move closer to each other, forming a body as each organ took its place. A new costume began to form around the organs, this time taking the shape of a circus clown instead of a teddy bear. It was wearing bright yellow clown shoes, a white and red striped outfit with blue suspenders, and a rainbow wig. The clown's face was painted white with pink circles on the cheeks and a black diamond that surrounded each eye. The carnival music started up again, and the clown jumped up and down on the road, yelling hot, hot, hot every time its feet landed on the hottest tea. After a few minutes, it caught me staring and waved at me as its head did a 360. He skipped towards my house, stopping in front of the sidewalk, and I stared as a bucket of popcorn appeared out of nowhere, and he held it out towards me. When I didn't move, the clown dropped the bucket on my lawn and then turned around and made his way across the street, jumping and clicking his heels together after every step while he shouted hot, hot, hot in a loud, cheery voice. He kept jumping and clicking its heels as he made his way towards Felicity. Hot, hot, hot. Finally, he reached Felicity's body and leaned down, tearing off her entire arm with ease and then taking a huge bite from the middle of it, bone and all. He stared at me while he ate the arm, and the carnival music slowly grew louder and louder as all the other dead bears transformed into one I hate. The carnival, due to recent violent events, pumpkins are no longer loud in Point Pine. It all started when Cassandra Wolfhart killed a pumpkin sprout. I didn't know Cassandra personally, but I knew of her. She was friends with Tom's sister, and Tom was friends with me. All that I know about Cassandra, I've learned against my will in passing comments from adults or other kids at school. That Wolfhart girl, now that's a picky eater if I've ever seen one. One thing that everyone in town knew was that Cassandra hated pumpkins. She literally could not stand the sight of them. I once watched her start screaming at the top of her lungs when a barista in the Point Pine Cafe offered her a pumpkin spice latte. That girl was weird, and her hatred of pumpkins was the weird cherry on top of the weird sundae that was Cassandra Wolfhart. Tom said that any time Cassandra came over during the fall season, she would avoid looking into their backyard. Apparently, the first time she went over, she saw their pumpkin patch and went white as a ghost before she passed out on the kitchen floor. He showed me a dent that he swears was made by her head hitting the wooden floorboards. But Tom is kind of a liar sometimes, so I just go along with most of what he says. I knew about the girls at school who liked to play pranks on Cassandra. One time they filled her locker with pumpkin guts, and when she opened it, she threw up in the middle of the hallway. I have to say that at first I found Cassandra to be a little ridiculous, but now I feel bad for her. So many people constantly terrorize her with her biggest fear. I think about what I would do if someone was dangling me off a cliff as a joke, and I realize that I'd probably react the same way that Cassandra has. Last week, I was at Tom's house while Cassandra was there hanging out with his sister Megan. Even from Tom's room, I could overhear Cassandra complaining about pumpkin spice season. I even heard her gag a few times after she said the word pumpkin. Cassandra left before dinner that day, but she found out that Tom's mother was serving pumpkin bread for dessert. Boy, that girl sure hates pumpkins. Tom's dad chuckled as he went out the front door. A few days after that, Cassandra's brothers managed to carry her to Tom's pumpkin patch in her sleep. And when she woke up surrounded by pumpkins, she screamed so loud that she woke up everyone in the neighborhood. They all rushed out to find her slamming her fist over the pumpkins, punching holes into a few of them. She had apparently broken off a few nails doing this, and severely cut up and bruised her hands in the process. They had to call the police and the paramedics to tear her away from the pumpkin patch and then sedate her so they could transport her to the hospital. Since her brothers had filmed it, they were in some big trouble with the cops and their parents, they said. She tried to go visit Cassandra, but she wouldn't even talk to her. She just kept crying and saying that pumpkins were going to want revenge, Tom said, as we did our history homework. Revenge for what? For what she did to them. That she basically murdered a bunch of pumpkins, Haley. I saw what it looked like afterward. She literally destroyed our whole pumpkin patch. I looked up at Tom, who was highlighting in a textbook. Yeah, but they're pumpkins. They don't care, I replied. She doesn't think that, he mumbled. I didn't hear much about Cassandra for the rest of that day, but the following morning, when Tom's parents went outside to clean up the mess, they found that all the pumpkin debris was already gone. You mean someone just cleaned it up? I asked Tom over the phone. I guess what else could have happened? I didn't say anything because honestly, I didn't know. Maybe someone just felt bad and had decided to help Tom's family out by cleaning up Cassandra's mess. It wasn't likely that she would clean up after herself, at least not without having some sort of breakdown. The following morning at 4 a.m., someone called police, claiming that there was a girl in a hospital gown wailing and running barefoot down the street. It was Cassandra. And when they caught up to her, she said she was running from the pumpkin monster. She'd made it all the way to our neighborhood from the hospital and collapsed on her front lawn. I watched through the bedroom window as the police talked to Cassandra and her parents for a few minutes. Something caught my eye off to the left, and I looked over to see Tom waving me down. I ran downstairs and out the front door to meet him. What's going on? I asked. She says there's a pumpkin monster out to get her, Tom grinned. Maybe all the teasing caught up to her, and she finally broke down. I looked over at the rest of the neighbors who had been drawn outside onto the street by the cops, and the crazy girl in a hospital gown. Or maybe not. Tom trailed off. I glanced back at him and saw that he was pointing towards one of the running paths that came out of the woods and between two of the houses on the street. There was movement in the trees and a flash of orange before something came out of the woods. What the hell is that? I asked. Oh my God, it's here. The pumpkin monster is here. Please, you have to help me. I don't want to die, Cassandra wailed as she saw it. And for once, Cassandra wasn't crazy. The thing that had come out of the woods was, in fact, a pumpkin monster. It was about 7 feet tall and made out of the broken pumpkins from Tom's pumpkin patch. The pumpkin pieces were crudely molded together to form feet, legs, a torso, arms, hands, a neck, and finally a head. It had pumpkin guts draped all over it, hanging off its body and leaving a trail of them all over the ground. It stopped in the middle of the street and people began to go back into their homes. It seemed to look around for a while, moving its lopsided, half-smashed pumpkin head from side to side, even though it had no eyes or any other facial features. After a few seconds, it headed straight towards Cassandra, who screamed so loud I thought my eardrums were going to burst. It began to awkwardly make its way toward her home, taking wide steps and fumbling as it tried to speed up. Oh hell no. It shook the ground with each step, and I held on to a nearby fence for balance. The police pulled out their guns and shot at it a few times, but it continued to walk unfazed. Cassandra darted between two of the officers and headed towards Tom and me. What is she doing? Why is she running this way? Tom asked. The pumpkin monster pivoted and began making its way toward us as well. Cassandra ran past us, looking back towards the monster for a second. She continued to run down the street, and Tom and I moved out of the monster's way as it chased her. After a few seconds, Tom took off after it as well. Where are you going? I asked. Don't you want to see what happens? I hesitated for a second before I followed. Hey, come back here. An officer called after us. We made it to the end of the street just in time to see Cassandra trip and roll down the small hill. We stopped and listened to her screams as she kept rolling down the hill. "No way," Tom whispered. We kept watching as Cassandra rolled straight into another pumpkin patch, her head making contact with the biggest pumpkin and slamming right through it with a dull thud. "Oh my God, she's dead." The pumpkin monster tripped down the field, falling over Cassandra's lifeless body and falling apart all over her and the pumpkin patch. The cops finally caught up and raced down the hill to check on Cassandra. But I was right, and she had died. Not even an hour later, there was a town-wide announcement. No more pumpkins in Point Pine, ever. Tom and I watched from the top of the hill as people carried the pumpkins away to burn them all at the edge of town. Someone had already taken Cassandra's body away, but left the pumpkin that her head had smashed through. For days, all that anyone talked about was Cassandra's freak accident. That night, Cassandra was seen again. Multiple people reported seeing her walking around town, sobbing and asking for help. I was one of them. I heard her cries in the middle of the night and looked out my bedroom window to see her standing in the middle of the road right outside her house. She was dirty and bruised, covered in pumpkin guts and dried up blood. She cried loudly, gasping for breath. "Someone please help me. Please, I hate pumpkins." I continued to watch as no one, not even her parents, turned on their lights or even looked outside. Cassandra fell to her knees in the middle of the road, continuing to cry, before finally falling face first, her forehead pressed to the road. "Please, I hate them," she cried. She continued to cry for a few minutes, and I backed away from the window and got back into bed. After a few minutes, she started to scream. She's done this every single night since she died. She screams about how we should have listened to her, and getting rid of the pumpkins now won't stop anything. She claims that they'll come back and that we're all going to die. I guess one thing that kind of sucks about Point Pine is that the dead never really leave. You won't find our town on any map. I've lived here a long time, but I never really thought that was strange. It wasn't until recently that I found the dark truth on why we were hidden from the world and why people like me were somehow chosen to find this place. That all started with the girls. It was always those Salado girls causing trouble. It was dark out sometime near 3 a.m. The clouds peeled back and the sky was full of stars. I'd finished my nightly beers on the porch and was just getting ready to sleep. I wanted to ease myself into bed and spend a while staring at the ceiling before drifting off. You know, feeling thoughts, suspended half dreams, thinking about the things that you shouldn't. And then a banging at the door, hammering even. Something really desperate about it, too. Haven't heard a hammering like that since. Well, now I'll tell you later. And then a voice. High female. Twang to it. She fell off the map. She fell off the edge of the map. Shit, Dennis, please. Dennis, that's me. That's what they call me. Though that being said, it's not often that the Salado girls have much to do with me. They're still a little suspicious of me, I think, considering I used to be a cop. Not any longer, though. The department told me a few years ago that I should consider retirement. They made a couple of offhand references to my consumption of cheap booze. A few shifts missed here and there. I got the picture. Folks still think of me as a cop, though. So I find myself investigating, helping out. You know the score. I guess you could call me a private investigator, but I wouldn't go that far. Well, okay, maybe I would sometimes if the right person was asking. But for the most part, I help out where I'm needed. I considered for the briefest moment, rolling over and trying to sleep. But my dreams aren't so fun anymore. And once I'm up, you know? No point trying to sleep again, Dennis. Eh? And it sounded briefly like she was turning to someone else. Lazy son of a bitch, Dennis. Dennis. Oh my God. Elena Salado at 3 o'clock in the morning. With the nerve to call me a son of a bitch, I shouted something back. I can't remember exactly what. Probably not best repeating it, if you catch my drift. But I heaved myself out of bed, dressed, and made my way downstairs. Now, there are rumors about the Salados, that they're in witness protection, and that the four sisters are only half of a brood of 8, all girls, and all the favorite daughters of a mob boss. I've heard the Salado family used to make their staff fight bare knuckle on their private yachts, that they hunted endangered animals for sport. When you get them all together, they speak fast and argue a lot. I don't know. I never saw them do much of anything, but hey, people talk. The last rumor I heard was a couple months ago. It was that each Salado sister, before witness protection, had to commit an act of arson. Their dad, this fictional gangster, would cover for them. But it had to be a business they didn't like. Somewhere they'd been wronged. I heard that it was only by setting something on fire that they could claim their family name properly. The townsfolk make them out to be these villains, but when I opened that door, all I saw was a scared girl. They moved here when they weren't even knee-high, and at that time I had never, ever seen Elena look so scared. For the record, I'd never seen anywhere burned down either. She was as white as a sheet and shaking. Her car, a beat-up, rusty thing, sat at an old angle in my driveway. The headlights cast a white beam of light against my house and into the woods behind. They made the trees the color of bone. I remember for some reason. In the passenger seat sat Elena's sister, Sophia. She's a little younger than Elena. Less loud, but twice as mean. I once caught her stuffing fireworks in the tailpipe of Marty's van after he accused her of stealing. That was a hell of a week. I know, I said. I've never seen anywhere burned down, but look, not that there was a lack of trying. I'm telling you this because Sophia was usually so full of life. Animated red ringlets, uneven teeth. She'd bite your finger off if you got too close. But here, now she was completely still, motionless. In the distance, there was the sound of cicadas. The car engine was still running. Elena's door hung open. Sophia stared straight ahead. Her eyes were vacant. She reminded me of a crash test dummy or something. Like no one was home. I had to shield my eyes from the headlights to get a better look. Sophia was paler than usual, and I noticed something else too. Something like dirt behind her ear. And then her head turned just a fraction to look straight at me. Vacant eyes, a small, barely noticeable smile, as if she felt me look at her, as if just for a moment she could hear me think. Elena spoke behind me. I need to talk to you. Her breath was ragged. Her voice was cracked and shaking. I turned to her nice and slow. That was the trick. Act like you were in charge, the adult. Show people that you were in control of the situation. Sure, Elena, I said. Of course. Do you want to tell your sister she's all right to come in? Elena shook her head. She stays out here. Okay, Elena. I can't have you turn up to my house at 3 o'clock in the morning, the two of you, and let one of you sit out in the dark, all right? If she comes in, I go, Elena said. Okay, we make this quick. Then I replied. Elena nodded. Her hair was short and greasy. Her eyes were a little red. I assumed she'd been smoking out by the lake, maybe got spooked and saw something in the dark. A hunter, maybe, or a wild animal. The dark played all sorts of tricks on your mind out here. I'd seen men who'd spent their whole lives in the woods think they've seen something impossible. I've heard them describe strange creatures lurking through the trees. Elena took a seat at my kitchen table. She looked around, and I was suddenly embarrassed since Lucy had all fallen apart. There was an overflowing stack of beer cans in the kitchen, a full garbage bag slumped against the bin, an overflowing ashtray, and plates of food piled up behind the sofa. Every single surface had something on it, a packet of chips or a glass filled with beer and cigarette butts. The only thing that was clean was the fridge and the area around it. It was a child's drawing. We won't go into that. Not yet. But the truth was, I don't think Elena was taking any of that in. She fell off the map, Elena said. I made her tea and placed it in front of her. It steamed gently. The light overhead flickered once, then twice. I coughed and made a sign for her to go on. I stood instead of sitting. It made me feel more like an adult somehow. Moreover, I don't know, in charge of the situation. We did it. The Dumont Lighthouse. We flicked the switch. Charlie Atkins dared us, and we did it. And then, Elena started to cry. Sophia fell off the map. I can't say I handled her crying brilliantly. I offered her a dirty dishcloth, which she refused. Instead, I stood up, half to get away from the crying and half to check on Sophia. I looked out the window with my hands behind my back, trying to take it all in, trying to figure out what the hell these girls had seen. The car was still there, but the headlights were cut clean in two. A long, thin shadow stood on the porch. Sophia was standing in front of the car, completely still, head cocked just an inch, the same wide, vacant look to her eyes with nothing behind them. Her mouth was open just a little now, and I could have sworn she was speaking, or at least her mouth trying to make a shape around words that made no sound. Fell off the map? I asked. I turned back to Elena, and for a moment it was as if her face was doing the same thing, her mouth trying to make words. And then she was back. She took a deep breath and drank deeply from the tea. The water must have been almost boiling. She didn't even flinch. She took a deep breath. The light shows the way and the way things can be and have always been. The light is the link. The light is the link. Elena. I interrupted, confused. She blinked and started chewing her lip. Her nails were ragged, but she bit them anyway. A hangnail on her thumb started to bleed. She shook her head as if shaking off a dream, inhaled, and spoke again. Sophia's still out there, Dennis. I can't explain it. When we were taking the boat back across from the lighthouse, she saw something in the water. She was telling me about it. You know, Sophia, she's not well sometimes. She thinks she sees things and she reaches out. You know, she let go of the oar and she put her hand into the water. It was dark. I couldn't see, but she kept it there for a while. And then when she looked up, she wasn't there. She had these in her hands. Elena threw a few wet pieces of paper onto the table, and then the lighthouse lit up again, and I could see just for a moment someone standing all the way at the top, looking down. Elena was still shaking and just staring down. The story seemed to tire her, to take it all out of her. I guess that they got the boat in June. Now, June was the resident madwoman, which, headcase, mudwalker, whatever you want to call her, okay? She let you borrow her boat in exchange for a smoke or a joint. And there was an urban legend about the lighthouse that pulling the lever or turning it on summoned something. I guess that the story spooked them and made them suggestible. They saw something, and they were in shock. Kind of made sense, but what exactly they saw I couldn't quite figure out. I took a look at the wet sheets of paper on the table. They were basically in tatters. The ink had run. They looked like old records, the kind you might find in an office in the 80s, and on them were faces that had blurred from the water in the dim light. They looked almost familiar. More familiar than I wanted to admit. Of course, you might be quite wondering what a lighthouse is doing in Ohio. It's a good question. Lake Bane. It's tiny, that's for sure. Barely even a lake by many descriptions, but it has a power over people. Alfred Dumont moved to Itchmouth after the war and built a lighthouse right in the center of the lake. That's how a lighthouse ended up here. Now, as for why, now that I can't tell you. Money drives people crazy, I guess. Makes folks do all sorts of strange things. Another rumor I heard at the nail salon was that Alfred Dumont released pythons in Lake Bane, or a rare kind of Chinese snapping turtle. You can't believe anything you hear. Not in a small town like Itch. They'll have you believe in 10-foot snakes lurking under the water. Hell, sometimes you might even start to believe it yourself. But Alfred Dumont was a strange character. No one knew how he made his money or where he came from, only that he rolled into town on a gray horse and that he wore a loose-fitting gray suit, as if he'd been a monk who'd become a banker. I don't know. He walked straight into the town hall and dropped $70,000 cash on the table. Said he wanted to buy land, and so he built a big house on the hill. After buying the house, he paid a few young men to smash every window in the place and carry off the shards of glass. He left the windows like that, like open mouths. Doesn't make any sense, really. But he bought the lake, too. Lake Bane. And with a story like that, there are bound to be rumors. You understand. Teenagers like to get all kinds of messed up and dare each other to swim to it, to avoid the pythons and turtles, and to climb to the very top and pull the lever. Only the very, very bravest manage. I would know. The lever turns the light on, and you can see the great white beam sweep across the shore. It's a beautiful sight, all things considered. So I made a deal with Elena. I drive them to their mom's house, and I wouldn't mention the bloodshot eyes. If they stayed out of trouble for a little while, I'd go check it out. I'd take a look in the lighthouse, just in case there was some nutter who was going around scaring teenagers. I could believe it, too. We get more drifters than any other town, believe me. Men would wander in, speaking in tongues, and then wander off again. I've seen it with my own eyes. How they find this place is another question, though, but they're drawn to it. Like moths to a flame, as the cliche goes. See, that part of the legend is my favorite, probably because it's the only part of the myth that's true. The thing about Itchmouth is it doesn't appear on any map in the United States. Not even Google, SatNav, whatever. That much is true. But the rest of the story stumps me a bit. The legend goes that Dumont paid cartographers, officials in the government, supernatural forces, whatever, to remove the town from the map so he could keep his secret, his little lighthouse in Lake Bayne. It was his domain, so to speak. I don't know what his secret was, or rather, I didn't know at the time. I drove the Salado girls home, told her mom I'd found them smoking cigarettes. She was drunk, half awake, and lying in the dark on their long white sofa. I don't think she cared or even knew what was happening. I thought about Lucy as I watched Elena carry her mother up the stairs and take her to bed. I went to the car and took Sophia inside. She didn't say much, but she hummed something just under her breath. A throaty sound, like a soft musical breathing. When we did get in, I couldn't see Elena anymore. I could hear the ticking of the clock, though, and the crackling of the fire. Sophia sat alone at the kitchen table and stared out into the night. For a moment, something like a smile passed over her face, before turning blank again. And then she turned to me and placed both hands over her mouth. Real creepy, like the kind of gasp you might see in an amateur theater production, like she was mocking me. You know, the dope these kids smoke just gets stronger and stronger. Well, she'd be right by morning, I thought. And of course, as with most things, I was wrong. The first place to go was June's. I wasn't sleeping anytime soon, and it was almost 4 a.m., so I figured, why the hell not? I drove out to the woods around Lake Bayne. Dawn was pulling itself up the horizon. The night was quiet, and with the windows open, I could hear the rush of air and the whine of insects as I got close. Elena seemed real rattled, I thought. Genuine. Not like some of the scams she tried to pull on me in the past. I'll admit it. I like the Salado girls, always had. They caused trouble, but they were good kids, really. Taking care of their mom like that. No dad in the house, taking care of each other. Which was why it was so strange that she didn't want Sophia to come inside, and how she seemed so scared of Sophia. Hearing what she had to say, I let the car crawl to a stop and got out. I took a deep breath of fresh air and let it fill my lungs. The air was clean and open and wonderful, and then I lit a cigarette immediately. I flicked on a flashlight with my other hand, and I started to walk down the thin path that led to June's. A low mist hugged the ground. Now June, how can I describe her? I heard she's a witch. That's a good place to start. I've heard she was a hedge fund manager who lost her mind. She threw her desk out the 43rd floor window and stapled her supervisor's tie to his tongue. I've heard she speaks to the mud that she bathes in it. I've heard she collects the bones of drowned things and picks her teeth with them. I've also heard from a drifter who I gave a lift to that June knows about places under the skin of the world. She spends half her days there, walking amongst the forgotten and the nameless. I kicked him out soon after that. Not because of the rumor, just that he'd started to vomit. By the smell of it, it seemed he'd only been eating paint for a few days. If you're sick of the rumors by now, try spending half a day in an itch. Now, all in all, June is a strange one. She can be spiteful and very rude, but she owns a few boats she rents to whoever wants to go out on Lake Bayne and dives for things people lose there. She always finds them, too. Lockets, wallets, waterlogged phones. I've heard people call her a swamp person behind her back. No one wants to say it to her face. The truth is, she knows the land like no one else somehow, like she's a part of it. June was awake when I arrived. No surprise there. I found her sitting on the tiny porch of her crooked wooden shack. She was dressed in a small knitted top and a long black skirt. Her eyes were closed, her legs crossed. Meditating, maybe. Well, I would have thought that were it not for the cigarette in her left hand without opening her eyes. She brought it to her lips and inhaled. On the exhale, she said, "Dennis." Yeah, I answered back. I never quite got over how she could tell who people were from footsteps alone. Did I stand out that much? I suppose I carried a little weight around, but, it still gave me the creeps. She was silent. Maybe she was waiting for me to speak. A few small lamps hung from the corrugated iron roof that covered the porch. Flies buzzed around them. Mosquitoes whined. Some bird called from deep in the woods around us. She's a strange sight, June. For one, she's a bit over 6 feet tall. Tallest woman I've ever seen. You might put her somewhere just shy of 40. Her hair is a dusty red, piled up on top of her head and her skin. You have to see it to believe it. It is absolutely covered in tattoos almost every square inch. Her arms, her stomach, her chest, her throat are entirely black. The rest of her skin is covered in intricate designs, words, and strange shapes that almost seem to move in the half-light, even her face. A spider web from one ear that covers half her left cheek, a sword on her right temple, stripes on her right cheek, a downward sword bisecting her forearm, 4 black dots under her left eye and 5 under her right, her forehead covered in an intricate pattern. Even the palms of her hands are inked, June, I said. She took another slow inhale. Salado girls are telling me they saw something out this way. I assume they borrowed your boat. Any ideas? I sighed. This wasn't going to be fun. If you tell me now, June, you can save me a trip to the lighthouse. Nothing. She stayed silent, which pissed me off a little, if I'm honest. No respect for my time. Okay, they came to me all messed up, saying they saw some guy in the lighthouse or something talking about falling off the map. Then her eyes snapped open. I fell quiet. "I go home, Dennis," she said. Ignore it. It was strange seeing her suddenly so focused. "Well, June," I began. I said I'll check it out. So I can't exactly just turn around, can I? Drive all the way out here and all. So unless you want to pay me for gas. She stood up now and walked over to me. She was a little taller than me, I can admit, but not by much. I peered up. "Go home, Dennis, go home," she said. I looked into her eyes for a moment. There's something in there that I hadn't seen before. A few chimes that hung near the lamps began to knock against each other. The skull of a small bird, hanging on a chime, slowly rotated. She smelled of incense and dirt. Her skin glistened with a thin layer of sweat. She was almost beautiful. She had a large, broken nose, huge hands, a mouth just curling into a mocking smile. "I've only given the Salado girls a boat," she said. "Only for a few hours. They said they wanted to get out on the water. That's it. No one in the lighthouse. I know if it was okay." She turned away briefly to tap the ash from her cig. I saw the tattoo on her back. It was a single, complex piece. The most intricate tattoo I'd ever seen. And strangely familiar, too. Long, winding stripes of black, all connected around small points. Small, dark flecks of color in a shape that twisted and grew and collapsed in on itself. It moved, with the muscles on her back, with a central point in the center of her spine. It was almost a spiral, but not quite, moving almost like a living, breathing organism. She turned back and caught my eye. "Just the Salado girls out there tonight. Take my word for it and go. Give a woman some peace." I started walking towards the lake, waving my hand up. That's all I needed to know June. "I'll be taking a boat out." She called after me. "Go home, Dennis, please. This doesn't concern you." And that was the first and last time I heard June use anything that came close to manners. I wasn't scared of the water. I like to make that clear. I wasn't scared of pythons or turtles or whatever the hell people thought lurked under the water. I wasn't scared at all. But the mind can wander, like when there's just the slapping of oars for company and the clouds begin to block the sky. The waters start getting dark like it's one thick, oily mess. The shore slowly fades behind you. and the lanterns can't do much to the mist that's rolling in. Sounds were amplified. The world as I knew it faded away. The water, the only constant. You're alone out there on the lake that time of day. Just you and whatever the hell lurks beneath the surface. I try not to think like that. I hummed a little tune and then stopped. It was as if, just for a moment, something could hear me. It felt like that. My voice didn't echo exactly, but it carried like the fog slowed it down. Tiny waves beat against the side of the boat. It rocked back and forth. The oars squeaked and cut through the water. I could hear myself breathe. I lit a cigarette, smoked it to the filter, and lit another. My hands were shaking. I like to say it was because of the cold, but that morning was strangely warm. The air was as warm as human touch. I kept thinking that I could hear something, a whisper here or there, a sound like a distant voice, like someone swimming towards me. I rode a little faster. Smoked a little faster, too. Eventually, I was close enough that the beam of my flashlight illuminated the side of the lighthouse. I could see the weathered stone covered in grime and the red door. I moored my boat on the shore dock and double-checked my gun was in its holster. It was. I exhaled and realized I'd been holding my breath even in the dim light. The lighthouse was intimidating. It held some sort of intensity. It seemed realer than real, like it came from another world. It had gravity, I guess. The same kind of gravity a black hole may has. There's an urge to escape it, but a deeper part of you is pulled in somehow. I made my way towards it, and I put my hand flat against the door. It opened slowly. The bottom scraped along the stone floor. Inside, there was nothing. No sign of anyone. Empty. A few wine bottles in a corner that had been here for almost a decade. They were dusty and distorted by the beam of my flashlight. There were remains of what looked like a small campfire. A few crumpled cans of beer here and there. An old threadbare backpack sat slumped in one corner. The black mold coming from inside it let me know it had been here much longer than a month or two. And the smell, cold and musty and sad. I don't know if you've ever been in a room where someone's dying. There's a smell when that happens. Or at least your nose is picking up some signal, and saying, damn, something's wrong. It was like that. Yeah, I didn't call out hello. I knew that if there was someone here, they'd have heard me enter. That was enough. And sure, I can admit now, maybe I didn't want to know what would happen if someone did reply, if some voice came back to me, if I wasn't alone. I unclipped my holster at the top. Always better to be careful. The stairs were worn and made of stone. It took a little while to climb to the top. I'm in worse shape than I'd like to admit, and that made me confront it head on. All those beers, those whiskeys, those cigarettes, they were catching up to make the sound here. The place echoed, sure, but that echo kept going until it seemed to change somehow, to collapse and sound like a dozen other voices. Voices that were whispering, humming, and the sound of wet tongues sliding against sharp teeth and wide open mouths. The top floor, where the light is, was empty as I'd expected. The view was hardly impressive. A faint bit of light at the horizon, but nothing else. I saw the switch to the lantern, the source of so many legends, and just above it, carved into the rusting metal, were words of the shallows at Bell's Creek with the light broken, and what the light sees, the light splits and has split, and what the light shall make the ramblings of a madman. Probably written by some teenager or drifter. I mean, what is Bell's Creek? What that meant, I couldn't tell you, but it was the only sign of any life up here. I hadn't heard a peep about Bell's Creek. Not in all my time here. Didn't know what the shallows might mean either, or what the light meant. How important the light might be to all of this. Now what I should have done is left the scene alone. I should have climbed back down those steps, rode back across the lake, told June, thank you very much, and gone home. I should have slept like a baby, dreamt of TV dinners and the endless stream of titles on Netflix, taking a six-pack of beer or a cigarette on the porch. But I thought of Lucy, my little girl, my kid. I remembered Frank Jenkins hammering on my door and screaming in my face. He was telling me he caught Lucy climbing all the way to the top and pulling the lever. The damned light blinded him in the woods, and Lucy stumbled in. She was frail, shaking. With her head bowed, when Frank had barely even closed that door, we both bust out laughing. Of course, she pulled the lever. How could I even be angry? Lucy, who was so sick she was coughing up blood, still managed to sneak out and climb to the top of the lighthouse to pull the lever. It was to prove to her friends that she still got it, and she's still one of them. Like I said, you have to be very, very brave to do it. She was brave, that girl. Always. That was a few months before she couldn't move much at all. A few months before she fell into a low depression. Kids that age, they shouldn't have to think about it, you know. What comes next after? She passed not long after. It drove her mother half mad. Did the same to me. And we fell apart. I don't know where my mother is now. We don't talk. It's almost like if we pretend the other doesn't exist, we might find some kind of peace. But it's not working for me. I don't know if it's for her. I hope she's doing well. Hope she's getting good use out of that Chevy. I thought of how Lucy's weakened heart must have been hammering in her chest. How after all the tubes, injections, and doctor's appointments, she still wanted to show her friends. Show that she, Lucy Miller, had it in there to pull the lever to face whatever demons that brought. And so I pulled it for her, you understand? And instantly, I wished I hadn't. It was a long, unbroken beam of light. It was so thick that it was visible as a solid shaft of burning white light. It was like a long arm stretching from the lighthouse to the shore. It burnt my eyes. The sound was unbearable, too. There was a deep, low screeching and a rumbling from the rusty gears. It was almost like a howl, like somehow the guts of the place had started to twist, and the lighthouse was a creature waking up from sleep. And at the end of the beam of light, it wasn't the shore of Lake Bane, at least not the shore that I know. It shone on the strangest city I've ever seen. There were spires and marble buildings and long winding roads, but it only appeared for fractions of a second as the light moved round and round. And in that city were people, faceless people, or almost faceless, I couldn't be sure. They had long, pale limbs. Human, maybe all in strange loose suits, as if they were going to work or commuting. They were all moving so fast, climbing up the spires and crawling along the roads. And then, dear God, even as I remember this, it makes my mouth dry as the light passes them. They turned and looked straight at me, up and at the lighthouse, and then they started to move. I know earlier I told you how out of shape I was, but damn it, I moved quickly then. I sprinted down the stairs, almost falling several times. I slammed the door open and damn near jumped into the boat. I heaved those oars like my life depended on it, rowed until my shoulders started to burn and my muscles knotted. I couldn't shake it. That strange city, the marble spires were like long, distended fingers, the winding roads that don't make sense. And those people, faceless, desperate, hungry. I moored the boat and I ran a little way into the forest before stopping. I bent down with my hands on my knees. Sweat dripped from my brow, my shirt damp and soaked in sweat. There was no sound now. Daylight peeked through the trees. Birds began to sing. How long had I been out there? I walked for a while. I told myself that maybe I'd caught some of what June was smoking, or maybe it was what my therapist kept saying when I still showed up to my appointments. Trauma, the loss of a loved one, rears its head at all the wrong times. But I couldn't shake the feeling that what I'd seen was real somehow. Real than real. June was waiting for me as she sat on a stump. She held a bowl of porridge in her lap and a wooden spoon in her left hand. I told you, she greeted me. I didn't dignify that with a response. I spat on the floor and wiped my brow with the back of my hand. I don't know if I moored your boat, I said. I left it in the shallows, I think. June smiled and took a spoon of porridge. She chewed thoughtfully before smiling at the shallows. I spat again and left June in her shack behind me. Now, I try not to think of the lighthouse for a long time, but it was hard. After seeing what I had seen in everyday life, it took on some other quality. Things were not how they had once been. I saw Elena a day later. She was completely shell-shocked as she lined up to buy groceries. She looked at me like she didn't know me. I didn't ask Sophia. I didn't want to know. Bells Creek, the shallows. I couldn't get those words out of my head. They hung around me, and at night I heard voices whispering the words around me. I heard them in the wind. in the call of a bird, or in the dripping of a leaky faucet. And sure, there were no maps about our town, but I figured the library might know something. I never bothered to look into the Dumont rumor. I was sure it was something we just told tourists. A little joke, but surely there must be a map of the town somewhere. And with it, maybe I could find Bells Creek. And once I did, maybe I could discover what had happened to the Salado girls, what they'd seen. I could help them, I thought. Their mother was an alcoholic, and sometimes when I thought about him alone in that house, it made me feel, I don't know, sad, maybe scared. Something fatherly, at least. I missed Lucy dearly then. It hurt. There was a tight ball in my chest and in my stomach. I drank more than I should have. I liked talking to her about these things. She had an easy way about her. She listened. She told me when I was being stupid, arrogant, or misled. You know, even when we fought and God, did we ever fight, she was always right about it. In the end, I thought about Sophia Salado and those vacant eyes. And I thought about Elena alone in that house with her and her catatonic mother. I had to help. I had no choice. The sun was up then, and I drove in silence. I didn't put on the radio, nor my CDs through the windshield. The light was weak and pale for a moment. The shadows it cast through the thin branches. Like a map, the sky was cloudless. It was a vacant blue, the color you might see in hospital waiting rooms or pharmacies. And beneath it, the town of Itch slowly dragged itself into the day. I saw Roseanne Atkins setting up shop. The Peters boys were smoking as they sat on their bikes. The light made their curly hair look like halos, though they were not angels of any sort. And then I passed by the Rusty Nail, the only thing that passed for a bar. Their door was propped open with a motorcycle helmet filled with cement. That was the way of things, the slow rhythm of life in this town coming in like the tide. I stopped for a coffee. I ended up having 3, one after the other. I started talking to Rick Costello about the weather. I asked him offhand if he'd heard anything funny last night, or if he'd seen anyone make their way down to Lake Bain, but he just shrugged. He was eating bacon straight off the grill. He was holding it in this dainty, delicate way with 2 fingers. I thanked him for the coffee, and I was out of there as I left. There was a strange thing that happened. One of the Peters boys sped past me on his motorcycle, and the wing mirror caught the light. It flashed, and for a second my vision was blinded by a burning white light. And just for a moment, the town I saw was Itchy. It was the towering, twisting spires. The same long, wet roads that reminded me of tongues. The same windows that looked like mouths, and moving around them, the figures in suits, hats, and briefcases. They moved not like people normally would. Instead, they scaled the buildings using all 4 limbs. And then in that same moment, it was like they noticed me. They turned, and I could see that they weren't completely faceless. Their faces were just incomplete, like some just had gray eyes or just noses or mouths. And then, as I stepped backwards into the nail, it all disappeared. But the image lingered. They were half broken. Searching, I stood there, clutching my chest. I was heaving and panting hard. Sweat soaked through my shirt. "You okay there, Dennis?" I heard Rick's familiar voice. I turned and made eye contact. After what I'd just seen, it seemed odd to me that he had all his features. But then he smiled and I laughed. I patted my stomach. "This coffee goes right through you." He nodded slowly, as if he knew that all too well. And you know what? Knowing what I know about Rick Costello, I bet he did. I bet he knew it better than I did. Now, Itchmouth Library is a depressing place at the best of times. It was a small white building that's a 3-minute walk outside of the center of town. It's bleached by the sun and runs down. The sign's faded, and something must be rotting under or near it. Because as you get closer, there's the strong smell of decay. The parking lot is entirely empty except for one Hummer. It belongs to none other than Charlene Atkins. Oh, Charlene. She went to an Ivy League school about 30 years ago. Top of her class, too. She was writing for the New Yorker, and then something happened to her. No one knows what. Only that she came back to town in Mute, got a job at the library, and, well, the rest is history. At first, people took pity on her. You know, the mind goes where it's going to go when you hear a story like that. But the longer she was back, the more folks started to avoid her. People saw lights on in the library at strange times. On its own, that doesn't amount to much. But people began talking about finding dead animals not too far from the library. And then a family came through and bought the only room at the Nail for a night. They were fancy types. Their kids read thick paperback books with long, flowery titles. They had manners in class. They mentioned they were professors somewhere up north. One morning, just after sunrise, they were sitting down and eating breakfast. When Charlene comes in, they look up and go pale. The man, the father, started shaking, honest to God. They stood up, grabbed their kids so hard by the wrist that they burst into tears. They left in such a rush that they didn't even take their stuff from their rooms, just drove right off. So Charlene sits down and drinks all their coffee, and then she eats their eggs, bacon, toast, and hash browns one by one. She stood up to sit in the next seat after she was done with each meal, and ate enough for a whole family. She was waiting for me as I entered Itchmouth Library. She sat behind a pale white desk. A single metal fan tried to fight the heat coming through the windows. The floor was dusty, and the desk covered in papers and books. In the corner of it was an ashtray with a mound of hardened gum sitting in it. Charlene chewed and looked at me. Her eyes were blue and vacant. Historical records, I said. I'm here to look for historical records, maps, genealogies, that sort of thing. Charlene watched me for a while, chewing. It was a sticky sound that almost echoed in the silence. The fan barely moved as it creaked. My shirt stuck to my chest, and I could feel sweat trickle down my back. I realized I hadn't brushed my teeth. My tongue felt a little swollen. Charlene typed something into the computer, and there was yet another whirring. She didn't look away from the monitor, just held up one hand and pointed down some shelves. That was as good as I was going to get, I suppose. Now, the only thing more boring than searching through historical records in a public library is hearing about it. So I will save you that agony. You can just imagine me searching through endless sheets of photocopies and leather-bound files, sweat pouring down my brow and fingers enough to blot out the ink. It took a few hours before I found anything interesting, and through it all, I started to understand how much influence Alfred Dumont really had. Look through every interesting fact about the town, or ownership deed, or controversial decision. If you dug deep enough, you'd find the initials AJD Alfred J. Dumont. His name, sometimes signed in his cursive writing, was hidden everywhere, like something trapped under the floorboards. He had a hand in everything. Hell, if a tree fell in Itchmouth Woods, you can bet Alfred J. Dumont was there to hear it. The closest thing to a clue or anything like it was a planning record for a strip mall. It had almost gone through, according to the council records, but it had been stopped by something. The word was smudged, so I moved on. I tried to find some real hard evidence, like a good cop. At first I thought the fact our town had no maps was no big deal, like it wasn't enough for Google or whoever to care about. And it wasn't important enough to correct the error. Nobody minded. It was so small it was impossible to get lost. And hey, who needed those big city tech companies poking their eye here in the first place? But the more I searched for a map, the more I realized how strange it was. You see, it seemed there actually had been attempts to map Itch. Several, in fact. A few attempts were blocked by Alfred Dumont. If you read between the lines, Dumont used bribes or threats or cash donations to charities. The few times it was done, it seemed the attempt went completely mad. By comparing notes in the records with some Google searches, I was able to figure out the bulk of the stories. All attempts at mapping Itchmouth resulted in the cartographers going insane. They drew spirals on the walls of their homes, carved them into their skin, and in one case there was a double suicide. There was a promising young geologist who'd taken it upon herself to map the area. She apparently found a really interesting vein of some special rock. Her husband, who was also a geologist, came with her. They were found in a car parked by the edge of Lake Bain in the 60s. It looked as if there'd been no struggle from the time of death written in their records. It seemed as if the husband shot himself first. Then the young woman had held the gun in her lap for half an hour or so, with her husband's body next to her. The cold stink of death filled the car. Before pulling the trigger on herself, the map in the back seat had been so covered with ink it was completely black. The blood stains didn't even show up on the map. Apparently, even though they should have coated it, every piece of paper in the car was covered in ink. The only thing that could be considered a map was the shapes they'd drawn into the mud. At the shore of Lake Bain, no photos of these shapes remain. It was, of course, the Dumont family who managed to get this double suicide taken out of Itchmouth's jurisdiction. They made sure that no one here ever heard of it, or at least that no one remembered. Reading through all this, it gave me the strangest feeling. It was like I wasn't really where I was. I know that doesn't make sense, but that's the only way I can describe it. Like where my mind thought I was located was wrong. My body felt like it was in two places at once. I felt like I was flickering between one place and another, like the candle in the wind. I could hear the fan buzz in the distance. There was a growing sense that someone was looking at me. I half expected to see a face looking at me through the shelves whenever I took a book down. My mind went back to those incomplete faces. I imagined the horror of trying to speak, but not being able to. All of this drifted through my head on that unbearably hot morning, but still I found nothing. Not one map of Itchmouth. I found a couple of leads that seemed worth investigating, though. The plans for the lighthouse had passed through various levels of government bureaucracy. I thought that might include at least a small map of the surrounding area. I was never much of a scientist, but I figured that Bells Creek had to be close to the lake. A shallow stream or something ran into it. I stood up and took a deep breath, and then I made my way over to the library desk. For some reason, that walk had me feeling the loneliest I'd ever felt in my life. It hits you like that sometimes. Grief takes different shapes. I felt hollow, scooped out, but also, more than ever before in my life, so deeply alone. Insignificant, I guess you could call it. I thought of June turning her back to me. The curl of her lip. How I bet Rick couldn't wait to have me leave. I felt all this rising in me as I turned the corner to see the desk chair empty. Now, I can't explain why I thought this or why I still do, so you're going to have to bear with me, but I felt those two things were connected. This deep, rising loneliness, and the fact that it felt like Charlene had been on that chair just a moment ago. Hell, the chair was even moving slightly, as if she just stood up a second ago. It took me longer than I'd like to admit, but eventually I called her name. Nothing. I put my hands on the desk and leaned over. Empty. The light coming through the large, dirty windows took on a gray, heavy slant. It almost looked like smoke. I became aware of every noise in the building, and for a moment I thought I heard something behind me. Then silence again. There was a flicker in the window. I guess it could just be a cloud passing over the sun. I slowly walked to the other side of the library. Commercial fiction, history, the classics. You know, standard stuff. Rows and rows of paperbacks, hardbacks, each row between shelves empty. My heart was going hard, like really hard. I could feel it beat against my ribs. The room seemed darker. The lights above worn on. Everything sat under a dull shadow. The white ceiling tiles were stained with mold at the corners. Dust coated each shelf and the old posters on the wall. And then I heard a click, followed by a low, rhythmic groaning. As I turned to see if it was Charlene behind the desk, there was a fluttering behind me. I almost tripped, and then I moved towards the fluttering. I ran down the aisles, and then I came to a sudden stop because I couldn't see the wall on the other side of the library. Instead, there were endless rows of books, continuing almost forever. There were aisles and aisles and aisles, like some demented maze. And it was then that I realized that it wasn't the fan that was making that noise. The low, rhythmic groaning was coming from a throat, a dry, rasping throat. Every now and again, the groaning was broken by a brief, sticky sound, like someone chewing gum, and behind me, where the library once was, were more aisles. I was trapped. The rasping grew closer. I could hear its saliva as it coated and chewed through gum, but the mouth seemed so large and so close. I wish I could say that I was brave then, that I made a rational, informed decision. But the truth is, I did nothing of the sort. I ran and I went around random corners and I kept hearing that groaning behind me. I heard books being knocked off shelves and I saw between the empty spaces where the books were, faces that had no eyes or no mouths watching me or trying to watch. And I knew if I looked up, I would see a city with spires and towers, and I knew then that I was inside one of the towers. Suddenly, I slammed into the wall at the back of the library, and then everything was as it should be. I was in a normal, quiet library room. Every book was in its place behind me. I was on my ass gulping for air and panting. As I left, I tried to convince myself that I'd just fallen asleep, that the rasping had been my own breath in that stuffy heat, dehydrated by 3 coffees. But I knew that deep down that wasn't the case when I passed Charlene's desk. I could see a single wad of used chewing gum stuck to a sign that read out for lunch. I watched a single thin strand of saliva drop from the desk to the floor, and like that I was out of there. I don't want you to think that my trip to the library was completely useless, though I did find one thing of interest. I found a contact by the name of Jake Colmer, or rather Jay Colmer Jr. His father tried to write a biography about Alfred Dumont, but he had disappeared since then. His son, though, had a LinkedIn page and a Facebook. Seemed like a nice guy. There were pictures from a barbecue with his family, a Cleveland Browns jersey, a post about a lost dog, with pictures of his kids seeming real torn about it. You know, that type of thing. When I got home, I showered and then I sent a couple messages. I was vague to start. I said I was a pie and that I was looking into a couple of unsolved homicides that occurred when Jay Colmer Sr. was still kicking about itching. I asked that if he had 5 minutes, it would be great to chat and then it would be quick and to the point. He responded quickly, which his message said. I paused. I stood and got myself a glass of water from the tap and then sat back down. I responded back, yeah, or itchmouth. Jay spent a while typing. I don't know what you're talking about, his message finally said. Itchmouth, Ohio. I typed, nothing on Google. I'd rather you stop trying to make contact, he replied. Dem, of course. I chewed my lip for a while. If I left it like this, he'd go cold. He'd chalk me up as some madman or something of the sort. He was, at this point, my only lead, the only thing I had that connected me to Alfred Dumont. I thought about giving up then. I really did. It would be so easy. Close my laptop, take a walk, get drunk. But something in the eyes of those Salado girls came back to me. Something about them. I sent one last message. Do you know Alfred J. Dumont? My phone buzzed almost instantly. The number I'd left in my message, I guessed. Jay Colmer's voice was frantic. You don't call me again, okay? You don't ever reach out to me or my family anywhere ever again. You don't email me. You don't message, okay? It's enough for Dad to be like this. You know, those drawings in the dirt and fingerprints on his skin, and even at the end. Sitting bolt upright in the hospital, saying he can see some great light through the window, that he can hear some. Everything like waves. I'm done with it. I have a family to look after, and I can't do it again. You know, faces in the shallows and bells. He took a deep breath. I could hear another voice in the distance, which he reassured that everything was all okay. I'm blocking this number, he ended. And with that, he hung up. Now, if I'm honest, that call shook me more than anything. It was confirmation that this was real in a way, that I hadn't just been hallucinating. It was the first sign that something was going on, something that went way beyond what I knew about it. And I wanted to know more. I made myself another coffee as it brewed. I let my mind wander. I thought about why I was here in the first place. We moved Itch just a week after Lucy was born when we were trying to build a family. We came across it one day, word of mouth, I think, at a party. We were talking about how stressed we were at the idea of becoming new parents, how the edge of every surface seemed like a death trap, and the couple we were talking to recommended this place. They said, why don't you move to Itchmouth? Lovely little town. I remember their clothes more than anything. Their faces were a blur. They wore loose gray suits. Real nice ones. They were good people, or so we thought. They gave us a few phone numbers, people to talk to. And even though she was 8 months pregnant at the time, Lucy's mother took charge. Before we knew it, we were moving to Itch after just one visit. We were happy here for a while. We moved maybe 20 years ago. Lucy died after only 13 years here. She was just a kid. We watched her body break down when she should have been out there running and jumping and climbing. Her life became just a collection of diagrams and x-rays. Suddenly, it no longer belonged to her. You know, it was taken from her. Her body became a thing to talk about over appointments. It turned into a bunch of pixels and graphs. I get lost in these kinds of thoughts from time to time. I'd zone out, then come back 10 minutes later. And it was as if I was coming out of it when I realized I'd almost brushed past the solution. There was one map of it. I don't know how it hadn't been destroyed like the others, but it was there. And it was close, too. Though getting a look at it would be hard. That would take a little more courage. It had been staring me in the face, almost literally. The entire time, the tattoo on June's back. Strange, almost spiral-like, made of dots and lines. It wasn't an abstract piece of art at all. It was a map. Now, can you believe that June wasn't happy to see me? As I walked up to her shack, the sound of the woods was all around me. There were cicadas, creatures crying out from the bushes and birds calling to one another. A large insect bumped into my shoulder, then flew off. I could smell with smoke, incense, and the rot coming from the stagnant water. And in a rocking chair was June. As she drew in a leather-bound sketchbook, she looked up at me and frowned. "Dennis, June." She gave a fake smile that exposed her uneven teeth, and for a moment I saw her tongue flicker. It was forked. Some places do that in big cities, I'd heard. I'd seen it in a documentary once. "I need to talk to you," I said. She put the book on the windowsill and stood up slowly. She walked over to the edge of the porch and leaned against a wooden pillar. She scratched at her exposed stomach and adjusted her cut-off t-shirt. "Yeah," I replied. "It's important." "So talk," she said, taking one half-finished smoke from an ashtray and lighting it. "Maybe inside," I said. For some reason, I felt exposed out here, as if the world could see me, as if there were things watching us. For a second, I could hear the sound of a city. "Out here works just fine," June said. She rubbed at her jaw with blue fingers and chewed on a nail. I put my hands on my hips. We couldn't be more different, me and June. There I was, shirt tucked in, hair crew cut, sensible as can be. And there she was, a long beige skirt that looked handmade, a short cut-off t-shirt covered with holes, and every square inch of skin marked in some way. And I think it was that feeling of complete and utter distance between us. That prompted me to say it. "June, I'm scared." She looked at me for a while, pulled on the sign, and put it out by pinching it between two fingers. "Inside," she said. But as she did so, she reached into the eaves of her porch and pulled down a bundle of sage. She lit the herbs and waved it above the door frame. I stood a while, hypnotized, watching until she was done. And maybe this is my memory playing tricks on me, but I could have sworn that there was already a coffee on the table waiting for me, black and steaming hot, as if she'd expected this. The inside of her shack was just like the outside, really. Just as mad and impossible to understand. It was filled with taxidermy animals, candles and incense burning in ceramic mugs. There were skeletons of rodents, trinkets, 3 ceramic pots filled with ashes and all kinds of gems and rocks. Sheets of paper covered in strange runes were stuck to every surface. A dagger hung above the fireplace. Large leather books covered the floor and propped up dozens of flickering lamps. June raised an eyebrow. "You know," she said, "you look any longer and I'll have to charge." I shook my head and took a deep sip of coffee. It burnt my mouth, but concentrating on that sensation made it easier to speak what was on my mind. "How long have you lived here?" I asked. She laughed and looked at the backs of her hands. "You're scared of what, Dennis?" Now, I'll admit, I might have thought she was the strangest, rudest person on earth yesterday, but now it felt like a relief. I felt like if anyone was to believe me, it'd be her. I felt safe here, even for just a moment. And so I told her everything. I left out the bits about Lucy and about my drinking habits, but most of the story. And she listened quietly. Occasionally, she refilled her tea from the kettle over the fire, or to fiddle with the trinket. When she did turn her back, she'd nod, and I'd watch the muscles on her neck flex, as if to tell me she was still listening. There was a pause after the story, and she smiled. I smiled back, and she began to laugh. This deep, hollering laughter. Nothing feminine about it. Rich and crackling and alive. She smacked the table with her right hand, making her tea spill. "Go on then," she said. "So I found no maps, right?" She said. And actually, I could have a tiny idea. You know where one might be. She stood up and lit a stick of incense. Turning around, she raised an eyebrow again. The gesture was beginning to become familiar. And where would that be, Dennis? She said, maybe 4 coffees in a day is too much. You know, the caffeine goes to your head, makes you all jittery. Which would probably explain why at that time, my heart was hammering in my chest. You're back, I said, looking at the table. That tattoo on your back. There we are, she said. So would you mind if I? Yeah, she said flatly. I paused. Sorry, June. Yeah, as in, yeah, you do mind. Or yeah, as in, yeah, I can. Yes, she said. As in, I do mind. As in, I like you to leave. I told you, Dennis, I told you to stay away, and you didn't listen. So here it is again. Stand up and leave and don't come back here, okay? Things were fine. Yeah, things were good. There was a pause. I looked at her and she seemed entirely serious. The light inside seemed to dim. Shadows fluttered at the corners of the room. A breeze made the old wood creak. I sighed. Perhaps I'd come to the wrong place. I trusted old June in her shack in the woods. Better men than me had tried, I supposed. Half in shock, I stumbled out the door and into the daylight. I fell on the trail and began to walk. I didn't argue. I bothered that woman enough. As I began to think about where else I might turn, or if I should call Jay Comer again, she shouted something after me. Why did you pull the lever? She said. I turned back around. She was leaning against the porch. I blinked. She lit another smoke and spoke with one eye closed. If it wasn't June smoking, I'd have thought she'd have passed out by now at the top of the lighthouse. Why did you pull the lever? Haven't you heard what the kids say about it? Not heard about the rumors. Those old wives' tales didn't scare you, Dennis. Her tone was mocking now. Big, strong man like you. Perhaps you ignored them, wanting to prove how much of a man you are. I just shrugged. Yeah, I said. I've heard the stories and I have my reasons. I started walking again. She shouted this time. Your little girl, is it? And at that I stopped. The world seemed to shrink to a point. I marched right up to her, and I spoke louder than I'd care to admit. I was almost shouting. I said that she'd do well to keep my girl out of her mouth, that the last thing I needed was some half-drunk, cheap Instagram, which with an inflated sense of ego to talk about something that really meant something. She cocked her head and I stopped. She was smiling. There was a wooden chair on the porch next to the rocking chair. She sat down the wrong way, so her chest was pressed against the back. Her back was now exposed to me. She reached up and peeled off her t-shirt, showing off the whole tattoo. Smoke wafted over her head. Ashes from her cig fell on the floor by her feet. She didn't look around when she spoke. Hey, she said. One rule. No pictures. Understand. It was only after searching for her tattoo for 5 minutes that I realized the obvious. Why don't you just know where Bells Creek is? I asked. She shrugged. The movement made the roads on her back stretch. Hills grew and shrank. It wasn't my idea, she said, or my design. You take what's given to you. For the family. And that was all she said on that topic. I spent so long examining the map. It was dense, almost symbolic. What looked like swirls and strange blots were actually roads, shorelines, and hills. And they were moving. Not so much you would notice straight off, but after staring for a while, they began to shift, like ink spilled on the surface of a puddle. Outside it was hot. In the distance, insects fluttered, chirped. I was aware of the sweat on June's back, the gentle ripple of her muscles, the slight swell of her shoulders. A strand of hair came loose and stuck itself to her neck. You, take what's given to you, I said, trying to act casual. She ignored me. There was something beyond what she'd said. I was sure of it. A sense that I was just uncovering the very tip of a world that went very, very deep indeed. You found it, Dennis. And I had, as I'd suspected, it led right to Lake Bane. Bells Creek, a thin, winding creek that came from the hills up north. It was hard to find, though. The map seemed to show 2 landscapes at once, superimposed over one another. There was Itch as I knew it, and then a second map, a second place which shared so many features with Itch, the lakes, the hills, the woods. But it was also different in other ways. I couldn't explain it then, and I can't explain it now. The closest I've come to it is that it was like those red and blue 3D glasses. You know, the ones Lucy used to love those movies, but the red and blue showed different images sometimes. An optical illusion. And this was a bit like that. But instead of moving your eyes from the red plastic to the blue, it was just by thinking that things moved on June's back. No pictures? I asked. No, and don't ask again. I was very clear on that. I sighed. I don't know how I'll find it. Not without this. Without you. You want me to come with you? She asked. I paused. I didn't know if I did, truthfully. She'd already pissed me off twice today. She had a habit of really running her mouth. The idea of spending longer with her sounded a little like torture, but also she seemed to believe. I didn't think any of this was strange. Didn't question that I'd helped the Salado girls. I don't know if she picked up on that, but part of me was beginning to think that this was somehow connected to Lucy. Not in that it resulted in her passing or anything, but just that what I found might help me. You know, you can just ask Dennis. I'll light a cigarette. Took a puff or two. Damn. Okay? She laughed. That hoarse, throaty sound again. Doesn't sound much like asking, she said. Will you come with me to Bell's Creek, please? I said. I couldn't resist throwing in a little sarcasm. She slipped on her t-shirt. Okay, give me 5. And like that, we were a team. Or at least as much of a team as you can be when your partner is June, when your partner is a half-drunk mud which with a mean streak. But hey, beggars can't be choosers, and for some reason I didn't like going to Bell's Creek alone. She spent 15 minutes or so packing a bag. Herbs, bundles of dried twigs, an unlit candle, 2 aluminum bottles of water, a couple of glass lanterns bordered in black iron, the skull of a mouse, 3 sticks of white chalk in a leather pouch. All the while I waited outside, occasionally looking through the door frame, and finally we were ready. Except her plan didn't resemble mine in the slightest. We can walk it, I said. Take the slow route round the shore. Or, I was thinking grab a boat and head directly across. She shook her head and started walking. Her bag clinked as she moved. She spoke with a hair clip between her teeth as she reached to tie up her hair. We're going to the lighthouse, she mumbled. The lighthouse? Yeah, that's what I said, isn't it? I was silent until we got to the little wooden dock. And from there we do what? I asked. Bell's Creek, she said. It is only accessible from the lighthouse. Look, if you want my help, and trust me, you have to trust me on this. Do what I say when I say it, and it should go fine. There was a conviction in her words I hadn't heard before, an authority she previously lacked. This place was hers, I guess. We didn't talk much in the boat. I took the oars, and she spent a little while cross-referencing between 2 leather-bound books. Occasionally, she'd take a pen and mark one before checking the marking on the other. She hummed to herself. It was a sad, broken tune that seemed to keep rhythm with my rowing. Odd and kind of beautiful. Soon we were at the lighthouse. On entering, she kicked aside some trash and pulled open a small hidden hatch in the floor. She hadn't unlocked it exactly. Instead, I saw her hand pass through it, and I heard a tiny click. Maybe I imagined it. She sat there, her legs dangling into the hatch. She took out 2 unlit candles from her bag. They were pale white with black markings covered by the wax. And then she took a cardboard pack of matches from her bag. She muttered something under her breath. She lit one, and the flame burned white for a moment before turning into the familiar orange, red, and yellow. It flickered. She held her thumb above it until there was a brief singing sound. She hissed, sucking air through her teeth in pain, and put her thumb in her mouth. And then she lit each candle, and I watched as the wax near the tip blistered as if burnt. Keep a hold of that, she said, placing each candle into a small lantern. She handed me one. Whatever happens, she said, do not let it gutter. Do not let it die. Why can't we just go across the lake? I asked. Wait here, she replied. Once I'm back, I'll head down first. You wait until I've reached the bottom before going down the hatch. Where are you going? I asked, but she was already gone, making her way up to the top of the lighthouse. I could follow the sound of her footsteps on the stairs, circling around above me. The echoes moved like the hand of a clock, growing fainter and fainter, getting further and further away, until they stopped altogether. I was alone, and as if to confirm that fact, a slight breeze pressed against me and the lantern in my hand, as if something somewhere was trying to blow it out. There was a mechanical shutter above me, and then I heard the hoarse wailing sound of the lighthouse turning on. I saw the unbroken beam of light sweeping across the shore of Lake Bayne. The sound was choked and desperate. I could almost see whatever great throat was making it. Suddenly, the lighthouse didn't look like a lighthouse anymore. It was something endless, continuing forever into the sky and the earth. It was connecting them as the water of Lake Bayne crashed against it. There were steps going down and steps going up. I could hear footsteps on both. Moving towards the center, towards me, I came to the sound of my voice being shouted and June holding her hands out. "Slow," she said. "Very slow, Dennis." I looked around me. One of my arms was outstretched, and I was holding the lantern above the hole in the floor. The little door at the front of the lantern was hanging open, and behind me were footsteps slowly fading away. They left shallow impressions in the grime on the floor. I pulled the lantern back to me and closed its door. June frowned. "We don't have long," she said. "Move aside." It took a good couple of minutes before I heard her shout up from the bottom of the ladder. The climb down was longer than I expected. At the bottom was a narrow passageway. The walls were coated in thick clumps of algae, which dripped a milky fluid. I fastened the lantern to my belt, and I could see the algae glittering in the light. It was cold, too, and beyond that, what sounded like the rattling of a distant train. Once we were at the bottom, I saw that we were at a crossroads. For tunnels led away in 4 directions: north, south, east, west. She marked the crossroads with a symbol and chalk, and then made her way down one of the tunnels. I followed a few steps behind. There was a shallow stream of water beneath our feet, rising just an inch. It trickled but made no sound. The only source of light was the flickering candles we carried with us. The walls were mostly bare, except for the strange way the algae grew down here. It seemed to grow in a single line. They formed a spiral going around the circular tunnels. The algae grew, as if we were walking through a lighthouse laid on its side, and the algae was following where the stairs would be. Every so often June would stop and mark the walls with chalk, or if there was a noise like a shuffling in the distance, she would stop and reach into her bag. She would hold on to something in there without taking it out. We'd stand like that, frozen and silent, until she'd exhale and shake her head. Then we'd continue to move, and she'd release her grip on whatever it was that she held so tight in her bag. The further we went, the more those noises disturbed me. They echoed in the space and began to fill it entirely. It mostly sounded as if a brick had fallen onto the stone floor, but I started to believe that they were something else. For some reason, the image of a bat came to mind. Not precisely the bat itself, but how it hunted a form of echolocation, and I could see myself then as a blurry figure. I thought of myself as a fly absorbing the sound each time it was made, and the more we moved, the more we were letting whatever made it get closer to finding us. June seemed to pick up on this and began to talk in a low voice. "I expect you want to know a little something about Alfred Dumont and the Shallows." I could barely hear her. The words echoed and bounced around the tunnels like bugs. "Sure," I said. It was growing colder. The spiral the algae made was growing tighter. The coils grew closer together, and occasionally, if I stopped to look at it, I could see the tiny spores moving, as if tasting the air and the warmth of our bodies. Alfred never talked about what he saw in the war. "That's the first thing you should know," she began. "He left Uniontown, Pennsylvania, as one man and came back as another. Clara, his twin sister. Thought that all that time, so close to death, had loosened the barrier for him somewhat. The veil had come loose. What people won't tell you, though, is that Clara mentioned all that before Alfred had even returned. She just said she felt it one summer evening. She just knew something happened to him, much like Alfred knew that Clara was sick. He realized it while he was still overseas. He knew before he even entered her room the same day. He returned. Before he even smelled the pale, milky sweat that came from her brow and the low, shallow breaths that smelled like death. He was still in his uniform, you know. He could have had a hero's welcome, but instead he marched straight up those stairs and into her room at that time. She'd stopped responding to anything. Whatever it was she caught had reached her brain, probably. Her eyes were wide open, and she was drooling from her mouth. Something like mold was growing from the floor. It was made of tiny black stems. He sat with her 7 days and 7 nights until she passed on the last night. A few folk in Uniontown reported hearing a conversation from her open window, saw the flickering light of a candle and 2 voices, a man and a woman laughing, talking with such fondness. It seemed they'd known each other their whole lives. And in that light, a few people saw other figures in that room. So the story goes, men and women in suits, dancing, telling stories. There were yellow clouds and the sounds of a river, the grinding sound of rusty hinges. A little boy even claims that he saw a gorgeous young woman lean over the windowsill. She called to him in a language he didn't know until he turned and ran, her voice following him all the way home. Whatever the case, Clara Dumont was dead by morning, and Alfred was gone. The only sign he'd ever been there was a single candle burning by her bedside. The next 5 years of his life aren't on any record. We have a couple of sightings of a man that fits his description, robbing libraries on the East Coast. But for the most part, he's off the record, off the map. When Alfred does turn up again, it's with tens of thousands of dollars. He showed up at a housing development on the Lower East Side. With a bit of foresight and a lot of luck, he managed to grow a fortune. Still, his business partners report he's a strange man, charismatic but quiet, smart, efficient, but not cutthroat, kind even. He works at food kitchens on Christmas. He feeds stray dogs, and no matter where he sleeps, he makes sure to light a candle by his bed. He'd stare into the light until he fell asleep. June stopped in her tracks. She turned around with a scowl on her face. The changing light of her lantern cast strange shadows. They made her eyes dark pools. That wasn't funny, she said. I shrugged and I looked at my feet. I know what that's like, I said. And I didn't know. If anything, the idea of Alfred spending days at Clara's bedside, it brought me back. Let's just say I'd spent some time doing much the same with Lucy. But you laughed, she said. I heard you. That dumb, slow laugh. All wheezy. I shook my head. It wasn't me, June said, reaching into her bag. She immediately marked the wall with chalk, then checked her lantern. Then we need to move faster, as if it could hear us. Whatever had been following us began to speed up. There were 2 sets of noises now, 2 sets of controlled, distinct knocking. They sounded like large bony knuckles pounding against the tunnel wall. The sound would echo, bouncing off the slick stone before fading away, and somewhere along that line it would find us. You could almost feel the sound pass through you, and then there would be a few moments of silence. That's when me and June would try and move as quietly as possible before the next knocking sound. But then the sound would come from a different direction, as if 2 creatures were trying to find each other. We were moving as fast as we could without making noise, and as we did so, the knocking grew more frequent. The spaces between the sounds shrank all around us. The stone glistened in dim orange light. The sound of our breath echoed. Our feet splashed softly in the water that ran through the tunnels, and then slowly coming into earshot was a familiar sound. It was a quiet, human voice, saying, oh, the kind of sound you might hear an elderly person say when they found their glasses. But it was hollow somehow, like whatever it was that was making the noise was using it just as a disguise, a hiding place. And then the little O's started to grow more frequent with the knocking. There were more than 2 things making the knocking sound now. Soon there were dozens of them. Small noises scattered all over the tunnels. The knocking grew louder and closer until it was a constant stream of noise. The spaces between were almost non-existent. 2 separate creatures were knocking against the walls all the time. Now they were communicating in some strange, frantic Morse code. I could tell June was scared, even when I was looking down and saying nothing. Oh, and then a ladder came into view. June almost ran to it. She grabbed one of the rungs covered in rust. As soon as she was within reach, she heaved herself up, turning back only to say to me, "Just look up Dennis. Follow the soles of my shoes." With that, she was off. I followed, but the knocking was almost unbearably loud. Now it reminded me less of a mindless creature now, and more like some giant insect toddler throwing some kind of tantrum. I didn't look back for long, but I saw enough when I did. Out of the darkness, I saw one long, pale limb. Reaching across the mouth of a tunnel not far from me, it was impossibly long, an arm that went on for meters and meters, dragging itself down the tunnel. I didn't see the end, whether it ended with a face or a body or what, but I got the sense that it was pulling something. Nothing along the floor. Something old and bored and hungry. The muscles in my shoulder burned. My mouth was dry, but just like that I was tasting air again and rolling onto my back. We were out of the tunnels. Above us was a sky I didn't recognize, covered in strange yellow clouds. We sat for a long time to gather our breath. Our backs rested against a black tree that had fallen over a long time ago. Well, okay, maybe gathering our breath isn't quite accurate. I sucked down a couple of smokes and chewed my nails. There might have been a brief period when I just laid on my back, coughing and gasping for air. I mean, look, if you'd seen what I'd seen, then you'd understand, I'm sure. You'd cut me some slack at the very least. All around me, the world was distorted in a way I've never seen. The earth was set at some impossible angle to the sky. The clouds were a deep, rotten yellow, and where the woods used to be were these towering black skyscrapers. They were all in various states of disrepair. Some were almost leaning to one side, and looking like they might collapse at any moment. There were missing windows and girders hanging loose. Between them were muddy paths. Rotting planks of wood went over shiny puddles with surfaces that looked thick and rubbery. We sat on the shore and saw that the lighthouse was still there, surrounded by the same lake. Except the water here was metallic, or at least it looked that way. It looked as if it was covered in a layer of oil fluorescent chemical rainbows shown on the surface, and between the dead branches were dying birds and rusting sheets of metal. Between those were little channels between rotting islands, where rowboats filled with short figures in yellow robes and masks used long sticks to search through the debris. These figures ignored us. They chatted amongst themselves, which sounded a little like dying birds or huge cicadas. June turned to May. "I assume you want to know what this is, where we are." It wasn't a question. I looked around again. I tried to speak, opened my mouth, and nothing came out. No question it could completely contain everything I felt at that moment. No question could wrap itself around the fear inside me. June spoke again. "Well, no rest for the wicked." I paused and looked at her, studied her face, that large, broken nose, the flat, observant eyes. I spoke quietly, as if what I said could somehow make it real. Realer than it was, at least. "Is this hell?" I asked. She laughed at that, the way you might laugh at a child mispronouncing a complicated word. "No," she said. "Not hell. Almost like it may be. It's the collection of the worst of us. We all spend time here, I think, during and after life. It's just a matter of whether we get out." "And do we get out?" I asked. As I said that, June pulled me low under the black mud. A group of figures in suits moved past, chattering and clicking away. A few of them only had mouths, and one only had a nose. They moved as a pack. Thankfully, none of them had eyes, just skin where they should be, flat and puckered. And greasy skin. It was almost as if they were hunting as they fanned out in a strange V formation. But as I continued to watch, I realized it was less that they were predators and more like they were sticking together because they were scared. I didn't know what to think exactly. I didn't want to think about it. June spoke as soon as they were gone from sight, though. June continued. "We're not really here, if that makes sense. Our bodies are at the bottom of the ladder in the lighthouse, our mouths probably open and drooling, barely breathing." "Okay, wait, what do you mean?" I asked. "The longer we spend not moving, the thinner the link between us and our bodies. And so we began to move through the city. It was each meth or a collection of the worst of each. The fears, regrets, pains, and nightmares of our town, all coming together and breeding like an infection growing out of sight. Some bacteria live in the wet, dark spaces of a wound. We moved from one alley to the next. Sticking to the outskirts of the city, we were barely making a noise as our lanterns cast a dim halo of light. We went until we were clear of the buildings and started picking our way through the dead black trees. Their bark was wrinkled, like skin left too long in a bath, I thought, and they leaked some pale, milky fluid. They didn't move exactly, but they seemed to occasionally tremble. Like, I don't know. They were wriggling in their own skin with fear, maybe, or with pleasure. I don't know. The trees grew thicker as we moved through them. They grew closer together. Occasionally we'd come across some strange piece of debris in the mud. An old-fashioned filing cabinet, for example. It'll be stuck in the mud at some strange angle, with its drawers open. And filled with rotting pieces of paper, there were empty glass jars, some human teeth scattered around like seeds with their roots exposed. Every now and again I thought I'd see the faces of people I knew on those pieces of paper. In the distance, a fire burned on the Rocky Mountains. It seemed to feed on stone and spat out thick, dark smoke that didn't rise to the sky. Instead, the smoke clung to the earth and descended down towards the ground like tentacles. June saw me watching it. "Everything is different here," she said. "They call that pale fire, fire that burns on stone. The smoke stinks and moves like it has a mind of its own. I mean, you've heard of will-o-wisp, right? Shouldn't be too much of a surprise." "If I'm honest, June," I said, "I think I've lost my mind. I don't know, maybe between the library and the city and the tunnels. I think I've lost it completely. I've gone crazy. I've actually finally snapped." She threw her head back at that and laughed. The sound startled something wet and brown in the undergrowth. As she paused, I read the map on her back, and we carried on like this for a while. She would stop every so often while I tried to see if I could find where we were. It took a while, but before long we got into a rhythm like any other. "It'll take us a while," June said. "Distance doesn't work here in quite the same way. And so to fill the time." June continued the story of Alfred Dumont. "So Alfred is a little easier to track once he has his fortune. When you have money like that, your name begins to appear on documents and financial records. And what we can tell is that he begins to show up at auction houses not only in the US, but all over the world. He starts buying artifacts from long-dead civilizations, sometimes legally and sometimes, well, let's just say he's familiar with several known fences and at least 3 of the most famous art thieves in history. Well, whatever, the point is clear. He's building a collection. It's not what kind, though, but he takes all the artifacts back home. No one but him ever sees them. The staff back home are told to avoid certain rooms. They leave his meals at the door, and they use a complicated system of pulleys to make sure his clothes and sheets are washed without ever entering his room. He gets through his staff quickly, though. They often leave after only a few months, usually because of health problems. They develop early onset cataracts. Burns appeared across their palms at night, and often they report seeing a bright winking light in the center of their vision that effectively blinds them. Some of them had gone mad from it. One of his maids, Maud Ellman, takes out her own eyes with a serving spoon on Christmas morning. It said she threw them into the snow where they steamed until she picked them up again, dropped them in her pocket, and sat at the table waiting patiently for Christmas morning. Personally, I think it was around this time that Alfred discovered the first of the glass Aztec, maybe Mayan. It showed him the possibilities, and after that, well, he was hooked. He started searching for that particular kind of ancient glass. It was thin, tough, cold to the touch. But he's not alone. Not much is known about the others who also search for it. They only find each other through mutual interest, all of them searching for the same glass. It eventually became known as Dumont's glass, because it seems as if shining a light through the glass illuminates an entirely new world. Somehow, light through this glass has the power to move from one world to another. Of course, these worlds are drastically different from ours. Space and time, they all move differently. But water's always the same. Bodies of water do not differ in size or location between the worlds. Now, Dennis, I'm not one to quote scripture, but June turned around then, and we locked eyes, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. I raised an eyebrow. She spoke again. King James Bible. Genesis. I blinked. Taking it, you weren't one for church as a kid, Dennis. The fact is this. The water was there before the world was made, before heaven and earth, before light. The water has always been there. She continued walking. The trees were now growing thicker, dense even. They were bristling like hairs, and the sounds grew louder, more intense. Sounds of distant trains, strained creaking, and something hissing. And so, Dennis, that's why they're called the Shallows, the group they form with Alfred as their leader. Because you can always find yourself, no matter how lost, no matter what world, in the shallow water. But Alfred, well, he had big plans. He's ambitious, brilliant, insane. He doesn't care who he hurts. His experiments cost lives. He offered young men ridiculous sums of money to spend days staring through the glass, or to live in a room surrounded by it. He made glasses for a Catholic priest who was found a day later at the bottom of a well with his pockets filled with stones. Eventually, Alfred comes up with a lighthouse, and where better to put it than a tiny nothing podunk town, Ichmouth. Using the light at the top shining through the glass, he's able to see the world just next to ours, able to look for Clara all he wants. And the longer that light shines, the more transparent the barrier becomes, the easier to go through. But the Shallows, well, they have other ideas. Eventually grew tired of Alfred and his obsession with Clara. The longer he found nothing, the more he searched. And the more he searched. Well, what he didn't understand is that you have to be careful with these things, because it's not only you who's looking into this world, you see. This world is looking back. And with that, we came out to a clearing. And there, sitting on a rusting file cabinet with a rickety fishing rod, was an old man. The rod was broken and stuck together with peeling duct tape. The man himself was in an old-fashioned threadbare suit, his hair white as a ghost, face gaunt, and hands bony and gnarled. He didn't look up. The line from his rod bobbed up and down in a stream that was flanked on both sides by filing cabinets. Papers spilled out from the cabinets and lined the shores. Behind them, the sky trembled. This was it, Bell's Creek. Alfred, June said. There was no response. She took a step closer and spoke again. Hey, Grandpa. And then he looked up. Did you see Sophia around here, or Elena? June asked. Alfred frowned and then scowled, his mouth twisted in a childish way. And then his face fell still. No maps, he said. Keep them away. Too much for them. Too much for us. In the light. He pulled up an eel on the end of his rod. It was glowing, wriggling, with a hinged mouth gulping at nothing. And then, taking it in one bony hand, he put it into a jar filled with a thick fluid. The eel tapped its nose against the glass, and then with a practiced movement, Alfred kicked the filing cabinet so a drawer opened, and he dropped the jar in. No maps, he said. Keep them away, all the world, the map. And beneath it and the spaces between echo and listen, and echo and listen, and echo and listen. He slammed the drawer shut and threw his line back into the stream. Alfred, June continued, we need to know where Sophia is if you've seen her here. If you've seen your granddaughter, Alfred. I interrupted her. Isn't that you? I asked. She gave half a smile. It's a complicated family tree. Half sisters, though the Salado girls don't know, and I'd like to keep it that way. Shouldn't even be telling you if I'm honest. It was just like June to slip in an insult, even at a time like this. They wanted to sell it all, Alfred said. The Shallows wanted to sell it and charge the weak and weary and wanting to come and to see those they'd lost and the dead and gone. The dead are supposed to stay gone. And they wanted to sell it and echo and listen and echo and listen. And in the space between, something grows and drags itself forwards, and he fell silent, blinked. A sharp pink tongue wet his lips. He blinked again, and something like intelligence appeared behind his eyes. Something piercing. I could almost see the man he'd once been. You shouldn't be here, he said, in the Shallows at Bell's Creek. Can't last. What the light sees, the light splits and has split. And what the light shall make clean, the light shall bring together. And he took a deep breath, and then he shook his head as if he was coming out of a trance. Oh, right, Sophia in the woods. She knows her name. They always know their name. Sophia in the woods. She knows. She knows. She knows. It knows. She knows. I know it knows. She knows. It knows. It knows. His hands were shaking even more. Now his large, wet eyes looked sad. There was something about the frantic way he spoke, like he was spitting the words out, as if every word would burn his tongue if it stayed there too long. I almost felt like I trusted him. And then, almost as if to prove me wrong, he reached up with his right hand. He grabbed a small rope attached to a bell on a black iron rod stuck in the ground. He began to pull it, ringing it so loud June flinched. Alfred looked at us, and with the last of his sanity fading, he spoke again. Go. We moved quickly. There was a sense that the bell had been connected to something more. The sky seemed closer. There was a sound like thunder, and a dim shadow passed over the earth. But we shouted Sophia's name at this point. We had no choice. It felt like every minute here did something to us, to me. It made my skin paler and my mind a little heavier, a little more warped. We shouted Sophia's name again and again as we moved farther into this strange forest. And then, as the trees grew closer together and the shadows started to move with a will of their own, I saw her standing amongst the trees just for a moment. I saw her frielier than I'd last seen her. Thinner, as a little more sunken. But it was her. I was sure of it. It was Lucy. My Lucy. Without saying anything, I moved off into the forest. I heard June's voice calling behind me, but I ignored it. The unreality of the situation, the yellow sky, the wet black trees, all seemed to collapse inwards. But I understood that there was only one truth to it all, one fundamental fact that lurked under the skin of things. And that was when my daughter was here. And if I could find her, hold her, then I could bring her back to the surface. She could be in my life again. I started to jog, and as if in response, the figure I was following started to jog too. She stayed at the very same distance, slipping between the trees like smoke. She would emerge every now and again to look back at me with hollow eyes, as if to check that I was still following. The trees grew thicker and taller. Soon the sky was only visible as pockets of yellow. Fleshy gray leaves covered the ground. My lantern made them glisten. I called her name over and over again until my voice was hoarse. I kept calling it until I was raw and ragged. Eventually I stopped, putting my hands on my knees. Sucked in a few deep breaths, I looked around and I realized I'd lost June entirely. I was completely alone. And the trees, they were different, less straight-coiled. It was darker, too. And then, as if to keep me company, there was a sound. I thought it was my own voice at first, a quiet, confused voice. Oh. I thought maybe I'd spoken into the cold air without meaning to, but my mouth was shut. And then it came again. Oh. And following it, a knocking sound in the distance, like knuckles knocking against stone. Lucy turned and her head tilted slightly. The movement reminded me of the way a dog might cock their head at a strange new sound. Or now that I think about it, the way Sophia had moved her head in the car that first night. I realized then we weren't alone, and that all this time something had been following me. Something ancient and hungry and patient. Another noise, more knocking, but the knocking was growing a little faster, a little more frenzied. As I continued to push on, I could almost hear something moving behind me, a wet, slick sound brushing against the bark of the trees, and the O sounds were coming from more than one mouth, distorted slightly each time. Sometimes higher or lower, they sounded pleading, confused, upset, but never loud. The voices never shouted or screamed. It was instead at this quiet, intimate volume, like someone whispering in your ear, like from a stranger on a crowded train, a secret. The knocks were coming more frequently now, and that sound. The sweeping, brittle sound. Each time it went through me, I felt like it was telling whatever it was that followed me, that it was getting closer. I moved faster as my lungs started to ache. My mouth was dry, my eyes blurring. Almost there, getting closer, I thought. I was almost delirious now, filled with fear and hope. But I was moving beyond that. I could see her. Lucy was just up ahead looking at me. I wanted so badly to protect her from whatever it was that was following us. I felt it almost burn within me. But behind me were more knocking sounds, like whatever it was had grown arms. More hands, I thought, and more mouths that it could say that sound over and over again. I'd never known what it was like to be hunted until that moment, and I realized then that every part of me was some clue that this thing used to find me. I ran. I ran between the trees, and as I did, I saw scenes from our lives together, mine and Lucy's. Brief images between the trees, like projections, almost like they were drawn from my head and placed into the world around me. They were thin, almost like mist. They disappeared when I looked at them for too long, only visible as something in the corner of my eye. But there were moments I knew so well when Lucy was born with a cowlick stuck to her forehead. Her first words said in a beam of sunlight at the end of our bed. The birthday party where she ate her cousin's slice of cake and they both started crying, blaming each other. Skinning her knee and bleeding on the carpet on Thanksgiving. The dress she made from garbage bags. The pale yellow of the doctor's office when we found out about her illness. The diagram the doctor gave us. That showed the dense black mass growing inside her. And the first word I said at her bedside when the nurse took my hand and told me that she was gone. The word I said more to myself than anyone else, as if my body had become someone else's. A grief so complete, so numbing, that all I could manage was one word. Oh, Lucy had stopped in a clearing. I caught up with her, and I picked her up, saying her name over and over again. But she didn't respond. She was cold, almost weightless. Her eyes were dead and vacant. And there was this sense when I was holding her that every time I closed my eyes, she changed a little. Why? I don't know how else to describe it. I ran onward, still holding her. My throat was raw, my legs were shaking, head pounding, and I ran until I heard June shouting my name. I followed her voice and came out into a clearing. June was holding the Salado girl in her arms. I was holding Lucy in mine. Mirror images, except Sophia. She looked a little more real somehow, more alive. There was a weight to her that Lucy just didn't have. The difference between a reflection and the image itself. Behind us, whatever it was that was following had slowed down, but was still moving through the trees, knocking and repeating that one word. Oh, it was almost as if it was toying with us, like it was enjoying the final bit of the hunt, wearing us down as we grew tired. And the whole time it kept growing and shifting and wanting. June was shaking her head. She spat on the floor and looked me in the eye. You can't bring her back across, Dennis. I didn't speak, although I think my face said it all. She doesn't have anything to return to Dennis. Not like us. Not like Sophia. She'd be like smoke. She'd be clinging to places she knew until she forgot herself. She'll wander around nameless, unknown, June said. Leaving her just isn't an option, June. This isn't a question of making a decision. The decision's been made. I am bringing Lucy, my daughter, back across, and I'm going to have her back in my life. I'm going to have my little girl back. The voice in the distance was growing louder, closer. It was moving from the whispered tone it had previously been to something more. My voice was shaking. It seemed almost silent in comparison. June looked very sad. She was watching me with lidded eyes. She shook her head. She can't come back, Dennis. You know that. Where do you think we are? Her body is gone, Dennis, like all things will one day. It's gone. The knocking on the trees grew louder and more rhythmic, less erratic, if anything. It sounded like a heartbeat, and the voice that came with it was beginning to sound more and more like my voice. You can say goodbye here, but the rest of US, whatever comes next for her, she has to do on her own. Part of her has already gone, okay? But whatever part of her is here now, Dennis, you can't help her. I know you want to, but you can't help her once she's crossed that divide. Once she stepped through the veil, it drove Alfred mad at Dennis. It made him do such awful things. Once you're gone, once you're through, there's no coming back. I turned to June angry. I was taking deep gulps of air. I could feel my hands shake, my arms shake, even though it wasn't the familiar warm weight of her. There was something like Lucy in my arms, and that was enough. Sophia's there in your arms. And you what? You're trying to tell me that you can bring back your what? Your half-sister, your cousin, whatever. And I have to leave my daughter. My flesh and blood and June cut me off then. Dennis, Sophia isn't dead. That's the difference. Lucy is. Lucy died. There was a pause and I said nothing, but still my voice echoed in the distance, moving through the trees. Coming from this thing loud and clear, oh, the first words I'd said after hearing Lucy get past, after hearing that she died, the heartbeat hammering of the knocking was growing closer too. Whatever it was so close to us, so hungry and desperate, it all made sense then. I think maybe it was how simply June put it. The actual word died, maybe. People had spent so long jumping around it. I had spent so long using euphemisms. And to hear it like that, I realized then what I had to do. I put Lucy back on her feet. I held her shoulders, though they weren't quite hers, almost like smoke. I have to go, I said. The thing was almost on us now. I so badly wanted to stay, so badly. I didn't know what to say. How could I sum up a whole life lived together? How could I ever tell her everything I wanted to? But you be brave, okay? She was silent. Her face didn't even move. I know you can do that, Lucy. Like the lighthouse, the lever. And that's all you have to do. Be brave. And one day I'll be here too, okay? One day I'll be here too. Lucy's eyes widened at something over my shoulder. I heard a tree crack and a shadow cover the earth. And then I was off, running with June and not looking behind at whatever was coming from the trees. Tears filled my eyes. I felt like a coward, like a bad father, bad dad. And I knew somehow I'd fail. I'd broken something, and I could see in the corner of my eye Lucy, or whatever part of her was here, running too. Off into the distance, into the trees, into the city, under the city, running to whatever came next. We were quiet as we made our preparations for the lighthouse. June hadn't just taken the Salado kid back. June had taken some pale fire too. The pale fire we'd seen burning on the mountains. She'd found it while I was searching for Lucy. The only thing was it couldn't last long here. Not really. But it would burn for a few hours at least. And instead of wood, it fed on stone. It turned stone to nothing to us. We set everything up inside the lighthouse, a pile of rubble and dust as kindling. Instead of sticks and twigs and sawdust, we used bricks and broken stones and shards from the worn steps. We threw in everything. And then, standing outside the lighthouse, we threw in the pale fire and watched as it burned, watching as the fire spread from the kindling to the steps. It fed on the stone, eating the entire lighthouse. Bit by bit, the smoke streamed downwards. There were tendrils of it, thick and black, crawling across the surface of the water, like Alfred Dumont's snakes had come alive. And then the lighthouse was burning brightly against the night sky. It was encased in flames that glittered in the air. It was loud and sucking in the world around it, orange and red and yellow, reaching upwards like a tongue or a hand towards the sky, taking the lighthouse apart piece by piece until it collapsed inwards like the city under which we had left behind. It was gone. There was, of course, one thing that survived the fire, a single palm-sized piece of Dumont's glass. It's too much, really, for any one person to handle. We've seen what having it can do, what having a window to that other place does to you. That being said, for a few years after, on the anniversary of our trip to that city, me and June would take the boat out. We'd row to where the lighthouse used to stand. In the dead of night, we'd sit around a small campfire and drink and smoke and tell the stories of the people we loved, people who were long gone. And when the night was at its darkest and the fire had died, we'd slide the glass over the end of the flashlight and turn it on. We'd do one long sweep along the shores of Lake Bayne. That city, those towering spires, those strange, featureless people. It felt so close, just touching our world like a stranger brushing past you on the bus. And when it came to a stop at Bell's Creek, I would see her waiting there, Lucy, sitting on a rock, staring back at me. And I'd try to say it with my eyes. You know, I'm coming, kid. I'm almost there. Once or twice, she even waved. The other times, she was motionless, preoccupied with something. But I'd like to think she saw me, even if it was just for a flash, just for a moment. But the reason I'm telling you all this, really, is because last month, me and June headed out there. Yes, we do. And when the light came to a stop at Bells Creek, Lucy wasn't there. She was gone. She'd moved on. And I don't know where or how or what it might look like, but I think that's okay. I could only help her get to the edge of that place. And as much as I might have wanted to, I couldn't cross over into it with her. She had to do that on her own. And that's how it is, and always has been, and always will be. We crossed that border on our own, and we can only hope our lives are full enough that once we're through, we can find our way. I see June every day. We take walks along the shore. She's helping me quit smoking, though she's not doing a great job. We both find that kind of funny. She's teaching me how to build boats, too. People are drawn to it if they're broken. It tries to fix them. Sometimes that works, sometimes that doesn't. I don't know if it always has good intentions. If the city under the city is a good or bad thing, I just know it's there, that there are people who would do anything for it, and people who would do anything to keep it a secret. But I'm done with it now. I've moved on. It's a problem for someone else. No part of me wants to return. Well, maybe one small part does, but I ignore it. I push it down. That's all I can do. June's taking the Salado girls under her wing. Hasn't told them she's their half-sister, but I think they know. They look up to her. June says they'll look up to me too, but I don't know. I'll believe that when I see it. She helps them with school work when they do it. She talks to them, teaches them things. She's good with them, I think. Uneven. I hope that part of Lucy has found peace, but I don't know. I guess that's the point, isn't it? It's the same as asking why there are towering spires in the city, or figures in masks on boats, or why pale fire burns so bright. We can't know what happens next, what comes after, and we just have to make our peace with that. That's all we can do. I've thrown Dumont's glass in the lake. I don't need it anymore. Me and June talked about it for a long time. It drove Alfred mad. It's not something we're meant to have, let alone understand. So we got so drunk we could barely stand, and we swam for an hour in the dim starlight round and round the ruins of the lighthouse, once our limbs began to ache. And the chills set in, and we couldn't tell up from down. I threw the glass as far as I could into the dark waters of Lake Bane. We pulled ourselves to shore and lay for a while. We lay still and breathing softly in the shallows, in the mud. I don't remember where I was when I threw the glass, and neither did June. And that's good. That's how June wants it. Gone forever. When the Salado girls go to college, me and June, we're thinking about leaving Itching for a while. Maybe getting a boat, spending some time on the coast, somewhere quiet. Out of the way, But what I haven't told June, haven't told anyone, is that I can see where Dumont's glass is. If I ever really need it, the glass, it's not gone forever. I can see exactly where it is, in fact. If I want to, that is. It's in June's tattoo, though she doesn't know about that. In the light of the early morning, as my fingers move across the vast, swirling map on her back, I can see it. I know I can return. If I want. It's there, visible as a tiny glint of light in an inky sea of black.